We've made the files the instructor uses in this tutorial available for free. Just click the link below in the video details to get these.
Let me introduce myself first of all for those of you who haven't maybe attended one of our webinars before. So my name is Deborah Ashby and I'm an IT trainer specializing in Microsoft products. So I basically design, facilitate and deliver training both online and in the classroom. And as you can probably hear from my accent, I am based in London in the United Kingdom. So let's get on to the subject that we're going to be looking at today. What are pivot tables? Why are they useful? You may have come across pivot tables before. You might even have been asked to put a pivot table together. And if you've never done one before, then it isn't particularly obvious how you would put one together or even why they can be useful. And I will say that with pivot tables, as I mentioned, they are brilliant if you need to analyze a large data set. And if you've already opened that file that I've sent you, you can see that that is quite a large data set of just very generic sales data. It's not real data. They're not real companies. I literally made all of it up myself. So we're not using any live data, but that is a good example of a large sample data set. So we use pivot tables when we want to extract meaning from our numbers. So by looking at just the data in the spreadsheet, it's very hard for us to maybe say how many sales per company we've got without maybe doing a formula or using a pivot table. And by far, pivot tables are my preferred method as opposed to using formulas. They're just a lot more flexible and dynamic. And we use pivot tables to really organize our data and present data so that it's easy for other people to interpret, so people can see exactly what it is that they're interested in. And leading on from that, once we've created our pivot table to analyze our data, we can then make it even easier for people, and we can make it really visual by displaying that pivot table data in a pivot chart. And we're going to look at that as well again today. And then if you want to really take it on a stage further, we can start doing things like creating interactive dashboards to display key metrics. And if you've never sort of put together a dashboard before, we're definitely not going to have time to cover all of it in this session today, because that is like a topic in its own right. But a dashboard is basically just a series of different charts and different ways to represent data that makes it really easy for stakeholders, CEOs to kind of zero in on the information that's of interest to them. So that's sort of why we use pivot tables. So but let's open up the data set. Oh, sorry, before we get onto that, let's go through the agenda for today so you know what you're in for. So we've basically just discussed what pivot tables are and why they're useful. The next thing we're going to do is we're just going to open that data set that I've sent through, because I just want you to understand what you're looking at before we actually get into analyzing it. I find people often miss out that step and they just present data. And if it's the first time that you're seeing it, it can be a bit sort of confusing and all over the place. So we'll go through each of the columns so we understand. We're then going to talk a little bit about the importance of Excel tables. Now, Excel tables are different to pivot tables. The main reason being that Excel tables are more static than a pivot table. A pivot table is something we can move around and analyze in different ways, whereas an Excel table is basically a table. But they are one of the most useful things in Excel, and I always use them if I'm going to create a pivot table. So we'll talk a bit about tables. We'll then create our first pivot table, very exciting. And then I'll show you the most important part, which is how you can pivot the fields around, move things around, so you can just analyze your data in lots of different ways in about 2 seconds. So it's very, very simple. We're going to talk a little bit about grouping while we're going through pivoting the fields. I'm just going to show you some other things that you can do with pivot tables, basically. So some of the most important things that you might want to do, how we can aggregate our data or change the way that we're aggregating our data, whether we're summing or counting or working out the average, things like that. I'm going to show you how you can show values as something else, so maybe a percentage of the total, things like that. We're going to take a look at how we can apply number formatting in pivot tables, because it does differ a little bit than when you're just applying number formatting to regular cells in Excel. So I'll show you that. I'm going to show you how you can toggle on subtotals and grand totals, change the report layout. how we can jazz up our pivot table, add a bit of color and apply a pivot table style. And then we'll move on to the section about creating pivot charts. So we're going to take our pivot table data and we're going to put it into a really nice visual chart. I'll show you a little bit about some of the things you can do to format your pivot charts and just make them a little bit easier to read and just look a bit nicer, I guess. And then we're going to add some interactivity by adding something called slicers. If you've never come across slicers before, they're a really wonderful way of making it super easy for anybody who's looking at your data to interact with that data without messing up what you've already done. And then finally at the end, a really important part, I'm going to show you how you can very quickly update all of your pivot tables and all of your pivot charts with the click of one button. Because the data, if you take the sales data that I've just sent you, data in general doesn't stay static. I might add more sales figures to that data the next month. So I want to be able to have a quick way of updating all of the pivot tables that I've created with that new data with the click of one button. So I'm going to show you how to do that as well. Now, hopefully that will take us all the way through to an hour. I will try not to overrun as I normally do. So let's get going. So I'm going to minimize down. You should be able to see my desktop by now. And I am just going to open up the store sales data. All right, so this is the spreadsheet that I sent you guys. So this should look exactly the same as what you have. Notice at the bottom, I have two tabs. I have one called store data that I'm currently on. I have another one called July data. Now, don't worry about the July data tab too much at the moment. We're going to use this at the end when we update our data. Our main focus at the moment is going to be on this tab, the store data tab. So let's just take a moment just to look at our data and understand exactly what we're looking at here. So basic generic sales data, we have the date in column A, and I've basically taken, or this data is set to take a reading on the 1st of every month, and the data is about 6 months worth of data. We then have the store in column B, so this is data for two different stores, Computech and Microworld. We then have the town that store is located in. These are towns in the UK. We have a store code. We have the country. We have the manager of the store. We have the category that item belongs to. So you can see here, these are electrical stores. They're selling electrical goods. And then the amount of sales. So this is the data we're going to be analyzing. Now, if you want to quickly see how many lines of data, if we press the shortcut key, Control down arrow on our keyboard, that's going to jump us all the way down to the last row of our data. So we can see here that this is a reasonably large data set. We have 21,576 rows of data. And you can see there with the date, it goes to June 2019. So I have 6 months worth of data here. Control up arrow to jump me back up to the first row in the table. Now, my data has column headings. This is everything that we have here in row 1. And I would advise you, if you're going to use pivot tables, you need to have column headings in your data. Very important. Otherwise, things just get extremely confusing. Now, the data set that we're using here is what we call a clean data set. And what I mean by that is that I've already tidied it up. I've applied formatting where necessary. I've removed duplicates. I've removed blank rows. Anything that looked slightly strange, I've removed out of this data already. And I was going to leave all of these things in and show you how to clean the data set. And then I realized that we have a webinar in a couple of months that's all about cleaning data. So I thought, I'm not going to do that now. We'll leave it for that webinar. If that's something that you're interested in, so maybe you're somebody who receives data from other people, or maybe you download it from external systems and that data comes into Excel and it's not perfect, you have to do a lot of tidying up to get it to look right, that cleaning data session is going to be one for you, because you're going to see loads and loads of shortcuts on how to do that quickly. So we're starting with a clean data set. Now, the first thing I always do, as I mentioned at the beginning, is I always, before I put my data into a pivot table, I always make sure that I format my raw data set as an Excel table, which is different to a pivot table. The reason being that Excel tables have the ability to auto expand. So if I was to add any more data onto the bottom of this data set, it's going to essentially become part of the Excel table, which makes updating all of the pivot tables a lot easier later on. So you'll see exactly what I mean by that when we get to that section. But for the time being, just remember, put your data in a table. You won't regret it. So to quickly put our data in a table, all we need to do here is click anywhere within our data and press the keyboard shortcut Control T. That's the shortcut for creating a table. Alternatively, if you don't particularly like keyboard shortcuts, you could go to the Home tab and click the Format as Table button over here in the Styles drop-down. So I've just taken this out of the table in case you didn't see that process. Control T to put our data into an Excel table. Yes, my table has headers. Let's click on OK. So now we have our table design contextual ribbon at the top, and I always recommend that you give your table a name. It just makes it a lot more meaningful. So in the first group here where we have properties, I'm going to call this sales data. And it's worth noting that with these table names, you either have to have, if you've got two words like I have just here, you need to make them all one word, or you need to separate the words with an underscore. You can't have any spaces in your table names. So we have our table named. We're now ready to create our pivot table. And there are a couple of different ways that we can do this. We can do it from the insert ribbon. We have a pivot table button just here, but I generally tend to find that I'm normally already on the table design ribbon. And because I'm already on this ribbon, I might as well use one of the options that we have, which is this one, Summarize with Pivot Table. So let's click on this. You can see here it says select the table or range. So it's picked up the data that I want to use, basically all of the data around where I'm clicked, and I can see my table name in here. I can then choose where I need to place this pivot table. So do I want to place it on a new worksheet, an existing worksheet, or do I want to add it to the data model? Now this bottom option just here, if you want to know more about that, that's actually what next month's webinar is about. So if you want to learn how to consolidate multiple tables of data and create a big pivot table, that is the one you want to attend. Now in this lesson, we're going to put our pivot table on a new worksheet, and I highly recommend you put pivot tables on new worksheets separate to your raw data. So let's click on OK. Now notice at the bottom here, we have a new worksheet. It's called Sheet 2 at the moment. We are going to rename it, and we're currently looking at a blank pivot table report. And then over on the right hand side, now I'm just going to rearrange this because this isn't how it will look when you go to it. It will look like this, okay? This is our pivot table fields pane. Now notice what we have in here. If we take a look in this top area, we have all of the column headings from our raw data sets. We have date, store, town, store codes, so on and so forth. So that is why it's so important to let the pivot table know that your data contains column headings, because it's going to pull those in and use them as pivot table fields. And that's the terminology when we're working with pivot tables. These are referred to as fields. Underneath, we have 4 currently blank areas: filters, columns, rows, and values. And basically, all we do to create our pivot table is we drag and drop different fields into different areas underneath to build our pivot table report. And it's really worth knowing, or it's really worth looking at your data and thinking about what exactly it is that you want to extract from your data. What are you interested in? So maybe your manager has come to you and he wants you to pull out from this data how many sales have been generated for Computech, or how many sales have been generated by a specific manager. So working out exactly what you're interested in is really going to help you when it comes to how you organize your fields. Now, as I mentioned, this is sort of the standard way that your pivot table fields and your little filter areas down here are displayed. But I know that some people prefer to display them side by side. So you can see we have a little cog icon just here. If I click the drop down, we can change it to fields, sections, and areas sections side by side. So let's click this. And it just displays them in a slightly different way. Some people find this easier, but it is entirely up to you. So now we have our fields, let's start to construct our pivot table. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here, we'll start off with something really basic. So we are going to analyze this data, and what we want to pull out of it is just the total amount of sales per store. So remember, we only have 2 stores, Computech and Microworld. So let's start arranging our fields. So I'm going to grab the store field and I'm just going to drag and drop it into this rows area. Now, when I let go, check out the pivot table report. It now puts both of those stores into the rows. And because I want to see the amount of sales, I'm going to grab the sales field and we're going to drag that down into the values area. Would you take a look at that? Within 2 seconds, I can basically tell my manager exactly how many sales we've generated for Computech. If I wanted to go a stage further and maybe wanted to remove Microworld from this, I could use the little filter drop down and just select Computech to see just that information that's of interest to me. So really nice and straightforward. That is a basic pivot table, okay? Really easy. We're just dragging and dropping fields. Now, what about if we take this store field that we currently have in rows and drag and drop it into columns instead? What does that do to our report? Well, it just organizes it in a slightly different way. We now have the stores running down in the columns. So we have sum of sales and we can still see the information. And then we have the grand total at the end. So this is what we call pivoting the fields. It's basically just moving fields around to different areas to perform different types of analysis. Let's do another type of analysis. Maybe I now want to see which manager is performing the best and generating the most sales. So this time I don't really need the store information, so I can get rid of this field. And to remove a field from any of these areas, you simply drag it outside until you see that red cross and let go. I can now add the manager field instead, and I'm going to drop that into rows. So now take a look at my report. I have all of the managers listed here, and I have how many sales in monetary value, not the count, how many sales they've generated. If I was to drag manager into columns, again, it just displays that in a different way. And for this type of information, that's not particularly useful. I would definitely have that in rows as opposed to columns. Let's do another type of analysis. Let's drag manager outside again. Let's drag, this time I'm going to drag store. No, sorry, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to drag town into the rows area. So now I can see the amount of sales generated by each town in the UK. So this is doing a very basic analysis, but this is a pivot table. Okay, that is pretty much all there is to it. Obviously, we're going to get a little bit more complex, but at its very basic level, you've created yourself a pivot table to extract data. Okay, let's take it up a notch, because so far we've just been adding one field into each of these. Let me show you what happens when you start adding multiple fields. So I'm going to remove the town from the rows. And this time I'm going to let's drag the category into rows. I'm also going to grab the manager and drag that into rows as well, but I'm going to place it underneath category. When I let go, take a look at the analysis. We can now see our data broken down by category and manager. So I have the category at the top, then the manager, and I can see how many sales they've generated. We then have the next category, then all the managers and the sales for that category. All right, so it's a different type of analysis. And when we have it in this layout, we can actually see the subtotals at the top here. So the subtotal for the cameras category is this number just here. Now, I'm somebody who doesn't like to read subtotals at the top. I very much like to have subtotals at the bottom. And I'm going to show you in a moment how you can simply move this subtotal down if you prefer it to look that way. We'll do that in a moment. Now, what about if I go back to this rows area and I rearrange these so that manager is above category? Let's just drag it above, let go. I now have it organized by manager, then the category underneath. So just different ways that we can look at this data simply by pivoting these fields and moving them all around. Now, what about this filters area at the top here? We haven't put anything into there so far. Well, what we can do is maybe if I wanted to grab the store field, I can grab it, drop it into filters. And if we take a look at the pivot table report, I now have this filter area at the top. So if I'm only interested in this analysis for Computech, I can select it and it's going to apply a filter. So now I'm just seeing the sum of sales broken down by manager and category for the store Computech. All right, and click the filter again. I can put it back to all, whatever I want to do. Okay, so really nice and straightforward. You can have a lot of fun with this and move things around and get all types of analysis out of your data. Let's do something slightly different now. I'm going to remove the filter, so let's take that out. And I'm going to remove the manager. Let's just leave category and the sum of sales. Now, what about if I want to break this information down by date instead? So I'm going to grab the date and I'm going to drag it into rows and I'm going to place it above category. You can now see it's breaking it down in a slightly different way. Now this looks a little bit weird because all of my data in my raw data set, I took a reading of our sales figures on the 1st of every month. So you can see here it says January and then it says 1 Jan and then 1 Feb, 1 Mar, because that's when I took the reading. So those are all of the dates in my raw data set. Also notice that even though I moved the date field to rows, notice that it's actually split it out into months and date for me. So it's basically looked at my raw data, it's looked at the date column, and it's broken it down in a way that it thinks I might be interested in. Now, in this actual example, this isn't particularly helpful. I know that all of my readings were taken on the 1st of January. I'm not really interested in having 1st of Jan, 1st of Feb in here. I just want it to say Jan, Feb, March. So what I could do then is I could remove I think I need to remove the months one out of here. No, that's the wrong one. Hang on 1 second, let me put that back. The date field out of here, and then it's going to break it down by January, February, March. Okay, so just be aware of that. Sometimes when you are dragging dates into rows or columns, it will look at the date and it will try and break it down for you. Sometimes it will break it down into quarters, sometimes into months. Sometimes that's helpful, sometimes it's not. So just remove accordingly. Okay, so lots of different ways that you can analyze your data. Now, because we have this ordered by our months and then we have our categories, notice next to the months, we have these little collapsible menus. So I can collapse up January, collapse up February, and I can also expand these out. So those kind of help me really zero in on maybe one particular month that I'm interested in. Okay, so don't forget about those. Now, while we're on the subject, when we're clicked inside a pivot table, as we are now, notice up on the ribbons, we have 2 new contextual ribbons, Pivot Table Analyze and also the Design ribbon. So everything that we need to format our pivot table, do different things with our pivot table, we're going to find on one of these 2 ribbons. Now, if we take a look over on the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, all the way over in the Show group, notice that the middle one there, the plus minus buttons, is toggled on. And that's why I can see these collapsible and expandable buttons next to the months. But if I just didn't need those and I wanted to remove them, I could toggle those off and it's going to get rid of them just there. Also, a really important thing to note, because I get this question all the time, is if your field list disappears or if you accidentally close it down, so if I click on the cross and that goes away, people are like, oh, how do I get my field list back? Click in the pivot table analyze, in the show group, field list. Click this, it's going to pop that pane back open. Okay, so lots of little tips and tricks just there. Now I'm going to rearrange my pivot table very slightly. Let's remove the months and I'm going to leave it on just the category and also the sum of sales, because we're going to start to talk about value field settings, how we can aggregate our data in different ways. Now, currently, this pivot table is just showing me the sum of all sales. So it's aggregating the data for all of the cameras that have been sold, all of the memory cards, regardless of where they were sold or anything. So I can see the actual total sales for each of these categories. Now, it might be that I want to see the count or the average or something completely different. So this is where I can go in and change how I'm summarizing or aggregating this data. So by default, it's done a sum, but maybe I want to see a count, the actual number of cameras that have been sold, as opposed to the monetary value. So what we can do here is we can right-click in Sum of Sales, and we can go down to Value Field Settings. And we can then choose how we want to aggregate this data. So maybe instead of sum, I want to count. I'm going to change it to count of sales, and now I can see the count as opposed to the sum. Another way that we could do this, instead of right-clicking over here, is if we're working in our pivot table fields, where we have the values area, we can click the drop-down and we can access value field settings from there, and I could maybe do an average of all of the sales instead. Okay, so we can aggregate our data in different ways. Now, what if I want to see the sum of all of these sales, but I also want to see the count? How would we do that? Well, I'm going to change this one back to sum so that we have our sum of sales. But what if I want to have another column that shows me the count? Well, this is really simple. All we need to do is grab the sales field again, exactly the same field, and drag and drop it to the values area. It's going to give us another column, and of course by default it's going to do a sum. So we're getting exactly the same data as the previous column. But you might have already worked this out. We can very quickly right-click in this column and we can choose to summarize the values by the count instead. So now I have the sum of sales, but I also have the count in the same pivot table. I can then change these headings to make them a little bit more meaningful. So sum of sales is okay. I don't really want this to say count of sales too. Whoops. I'm going to click in the cell, double click, and we're going to take the 2 off the end just to change the title of that field. Now notice as soon as I did that, the pivot table kind of jumped and rearranged itself. It collapsed up its columns. And you'll notice that if you start doing things like widening columns so that you can see the data a bit better, when you change the fields around, or even if you do a refresh of your pivot table, these are going to jump back to how they were originally. So let me show you a quick example of that. If I go up to refresh, and I'm just going to say refresh all, it's going to jump back to auto width, basically. So the width of the longest item in the cell. So if you have specific widths that you want to keep your pivot table at, you need to make sure that you change that in your pivot table options. And then when you start moving fields around or refreshing pivot tables, the column widths aren't going to change. Sometimes that can be a real pain if you've spent ages making a pivot table look really nice and getting those column widths exactly as you want them. As soon as you change something in the pivot table, it just collapses back up to how it was originally. So to retain these column widths, we need to go to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. We're going to go across to Options. And in here, right towards the bottom, we have an option here, Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. So I want to deselect this because I want to keep it as the column widths that I've set. So let's click on OK. And now if I was to refresh this pivot table, those column widths aren't going to change. Okay, so just a little tip there, which I see very few people point out, and it can be really valuable. Now, another thing that we can do once we've sort of done this summary just here is that we can show our values as something else. So maybe I want to show the sum of sales for each of the categories as a percentage of the grand total. So what I'm going to do is I want this to be in another column. So I'm going to grab another sales field, drag it down to values. Of course, by default, it's going to do a sum of sales too. But straight away, I'm going to right click and we're going to say, show values as, and then I have various different options in here. So I want to show my values as a percentage of the grand total. And I'm going to rename this field at the top here to say percentage of grand total, like so. So now I can actually see the actual percentage of total sales that the camera sales make up. Okay, so this is another really nice way that we can analyze it. And we have lots of other things within this show values add that we can do. So we can show running totals, we can show percentages of the column total, lots of different calculations that we can perform. Okay, so just keep adding sales fields and changing them to show exactly what you're interested in. All right, so really nice and straightforward. Now, I'm going to undo some of that work that we've just done. I'm going to remove some of these fields. So I'm just going to take it back to just having the sum of sales. So let's remove percentage of grand total and also the count of the sales, because we're going to move on to talking about number formatting. So far we haven't spoken about number formatting. And if you take a look at the sum of sales column in our pivot table, currently our values don't have any formatting. We don't have any commas, we don't have any decimal places, we don't have any currency symbols. Now, the way that you apply number formatting in a pivot table is slightly different to if you're just applying number formatting in an Excel spreadsheet. What we don't do is we don't select our data just here and then go to home and select our number format. We don't do it that way. What we do instead is we click within our data, we right click, we go down to value field settings and we choose number format from here. And then we can go in and choose the formatting that we want. So I'm just going to choose, let's go for currency formatting. I'm going to take the decimal places down to 0. And as we've got so many people on the call today from the US, I'm going to leave it on the dollar symbol. Let's click on OK and OK again, and it's going to apply that number formatting. Okay, so remember to apply it that way as opposed to selecting the cells. The reason why we don't select the cells and apply the number formatting is if those pivot table fields then move, if we rearrange our pivot table fields, the formatting doesn't carry with it. It's applied to the cell. So you're going to get sort of some numbers with formatting and some numbers without. Okay, so that's why we do it in a slightly different way. Let's move on to taking a look at some of the ways that we can change the way that our pivot table report looks. Now for this, I'm going to add in another field. Let's go for manager again. I'm going to drop that into rows. I think I'm going to put manager above category actually. Let's organize it like that. All right, because I want to talk to you about subtotals and grand totals. I briefly touched on this at the beginning of the session. When you have your data organized like this, so multiple fields within rows, you're going to see subtotals at the top by default. Now, if you don't like this, if you're someone who prefers to read your subtotals at the bottom, I am one of those people, then we can change that. And we do this on the, I think it's on the design ribbon. Yes, the design ribbon at the top here. Now, the first group here is the layout group. And we have a subtotals drop down. So we can choose to turn our subtotals off entirely, or we can show them at the bottom or at the top of the group. So I'm going to switch mine to show at the bottom of the group, and I can now see the subtotal for Felicity Chambers. Okay, so this is entirely personal preference. You might prefer them to be at the top, or you might just want to turn them off altogether. Entirely up to you. Now, the same thing applies for your grand totals. You're always going to have, and I have quite a lot of data here, a grand total right at the bottom. So this is just a total of everything in that column of the pivot table. If you like that, you can keep it on. If you want to turn it off, you have various different options here. So you could turn it off for rows and columns, which will turn it off entirely. And I will say that if you do plan on putting your pivot table or putting it into a pivot chart, it's always good to turn off the grand total because you don't really want to include most of the time a grand total in your visual analysis. So I'm going to turn this off for rows and columns. Like so. So very, very simple. What else can we do in this little group? Well, we can change the report layout. So by default, I'm showing my pivot table in compact form, but I could choose to show it in outline form, which gives me a slightly different way of viewing it. It puts the manager name into its own separate column as to kind of putting it in the same column as the category. I can change it to tabular form. Again, something very slightly different. You might find this easier to read. Or I can go back to compact form. Now, if I have this in tabular form, I might want to repeat the manager labels all the way down through all of these rows. Sometimes that can be quite helpful. We can choose to repeat all item labels, which is going to put this into each row. Now, for me, that looks a little bit overwhelming. I'm going to remove those item labels and put it back to compact view. But just remember, you've got different layouts for your report. Choose one that's most appropriate for your data. We can even add in blank rows. So if I want to insert a blank line, I can do that. It just gives a little bit of separation between each item in your pivot table. Again, just makes it a bit easier to read. So think about all of those things when you're putting together your pivot table. Now, just a couple of things related to pivot table styles. There's nothing too complex here. Again, if we work up on the design ribbon, we have a big old group here, which opens up a gallery of different types of formatting, different styles that we can apply to our pivot tables. And we can hover over and get a nice live preview as to what each of these look like. So go through these, choose one that appeals to you. I'm just going to choose this one because I really like the color rose. Why not? That will quickly apply to your pivot table. Once you've applied a style, you can then customize that style further by turning on these different pivot table style options. So if I click on banded rows, that's just going to put some lines running across, again, which makes this a bit easier to read. I can do various different things. You can see as I toggle this off and on, it removes the formatting from the column header. I can do the same with the row headers, or I can choose to have banded columns, things like that. And these pivot table style options work slightly differently depending on which style you've selected. So it's always worth selecting a style, having a play around with these until you get your pivot table into a really nice, easy to read format. So that's kind of how pivot tables work. You know, you can get more complex, you can delve in, you can get a bit more advanced with different things, but that is basically the concept behind them. Now, one thing I would say is that if you are going to be creating lots of different types of analysis, so maybe you want to do what we've done here. So we're summarizing by manager and category, but maybe then you want to just see a breakdown of the sales by the store. You might want to create multiple different pivot tables. Now, the easiest way to do that for me is to simply copy the current pivot table. And when I say copy, I just mean copy the entire worksheet. Now, before we do that, I'm going to rename this worksheet so that it accurately represents what's on this worksheet. So let's right click, let's rename it. And I always name my worksheets if they contain a pivot table, PVT. That's my standard naming convention. And then what is this showing? Well, this is a summary by manager and category. So I'm just going to say man, oops, I can't type today, underscore cat. I have an idea as to what this pivot table represents. Now, if I wanted to do another pivot table, all I would do is copy the entire worksheet. And you can do that very quickly by holding down Control and then just dragging and dropping the tab. It's going to create a copy. We're going to have the pivot table on here, and we can then rearrange this pivot table to show what we want in the second analysis. So maybe I just want to analyze by store on this particular pivot table. And maybe I want to turn on grand totals for this particular one. Like so. Maybe I want to change the style of this pivot table. I can do that. So now very quickly, I've managed to create two different types of analysis using the same pivot table. I haven't had to go back to the raw data and start all over again. I then simply right click and rename this tab. This one might be called pivot underscore store underscore sales, something like that. And I would carry on duplicating for as many analyses as I need to do. So that's a nice little quick trick for creating multiple pivot tables. Now we've got about 9 minutes left, so we're going to finish up by taking a look at pivot charts and also slicers. And believe it or not, despite that delay, we've managed to cover pretty much everything, which is great. So let's take a quick look at how we can analyze using charts. So when we use a chart, we're just basically visually interpreting the data that we have in the pivot table. And a lot of people find a chart a lot easier to read than maybe just simply looking at data. Charts are particularly good if you're trying to compare different items. It's a lot easier to see if it's in a chart. Now, I will say that when it comes to creating a pivot chart, you really need to take a good look at the data that you have in your pivot table and think about what type of chart is going to suit your data best, because not all charts are created equally. And I'm going to show you an example of this. I'm just going to rearrange these fields a little bit just to demonstrate this. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to remove category so that we just have a list of the managers and their sum of sales. So if I wanted to put this data into a pivot chart, what I could do is go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and over in the Tools group, I have a Pivot Chart button. Now, if I click on Pivot Chart, it's going to allow me to select all different kinds of charts, and they're organized down into different categories. Now, maybe I decide that I really like pie charts. I don't, for the record, but maybe I decide today I want to put this data in a pie chart. So I'm going to select the pie chart, click on OK, and I've got a bit too much data for this pie chart. It's not particularly easy to see. And because all of these sales are reasonably close together, it's very hard for me to see just by looking at the pie chart exactly sort of who's generated the most sales. It's not a particularly good analysis using a chart. And because I have quite a few different managers, I have to make this chart quite big in order to be able to see them all in this legend. So this isn't a particularly good chart for the type of data that I want to analyze. So think about that. In general, the general rule that I tend to live by is things like column charts and bar charts are pretty much universal. They're pretty good at representing any type of data. Whereas if you have maybe time-based data, so maybe we had sales over January to December, those are always nicely represented using things like line charts. I would only ever use a pie chart, and I very rarely use pie charts for very, very small amounts of data. So maybe if I just wanted to show the amount of sales by store, because I only have 2 stores, a pie chart would be quite a nice chart to use to represent that data. So really think about the chart type that you're using before you put together your chart. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to create a very basic bar chart. I'm going to select bar. We're just going to use the basic bar chart just here and click on OK. And that's going to give me my pivot chart. Let's drag this down. Now, again, I have quite a bit of information on here, and what I would say is that when you're trying to visually represent data, don't try to cram as much information into your chart as possible. For example, if I wanted to show this to maybe my CEO or maybe some key stakeholders, maybe they're not interested in seeing all of the managers and how many sales they've generated. Maybe they only really want to see the top 5 managers. So that would be a much better data set to represent in a chart because it's a lot smaller and it's a lot easier to compare. And we're really honing in on what we want to see. So what I would do here is I would go to my pivot table, click where we have row labels, and I'm going to apply a filter. And I'm going to apply a top 10 filter. And I'm going to say only show me the top 5 items by sum of sales. And items in this case is going to be the managers. So when I click on this, I now see who the top managers were. If I want to sort these, I can do that from here as well. If I click the drop down, I can sort A to Z or Z to A. I actually don't want to do that. I want to right click and I want to sort smallest to largest or largest to smallest. So if I want to see the top selling manager at the top, I can do largest to smallest, and I can see that Spencer Lee has generated the most sales. And this is a much nicer data set to show in a pivot chart. Another thing when it comes to pivot charts is you want to make them as clean looking as possible. You don't want loads of things on your pivot chart that aren't necessary, okay? The simpler, the better when it comes to pivot charts. So the first thing I always do when I've created a pivot chart is I come in and I remove any unwanted items. So these little grey buttons here, these are little filters. We can filter our pivot chart, but I actually prefer to do my filtering in the pivot table, which will in turn update the pivot chart. So I'm going to remove these grey buttons simply by right-clicking and saying hide all field buttons on chart. I'm then going to click up in the chart title and I'm going to give my chart a name so everybody knows what this represents. So this is showing the top 5 managers. Oops. managers by sales. Okay, so very, very simple. Other things that we can do here, we have a little legend. Now, sometimes the legend is really useful. It shows you, what each bar represents on the chart. In this case, it just says total, not particularly useful at all. So we can get rid of the legend in a few different ways. It is just a text box. I can select it and just press the delete key. Alternatively, if I click the plus icon just here, I can turn off and on different elements of my chart. So I could deselect legend and that's going to remove it. Okay. A couple of other little tricks because we are running out of time, things that I do when I'm tidying up charts is sometimes I like to add data labels as opposed to having this horizontal axis at the bottom. So again, if we click on the plus next to the chart, I can add data labels. And if I click the arrow, I'm going to display them on the inside end of the bar. I can then select those data labels and apply formatting. So if I want to change the color, maybe I want to make them white, I can simply go to the home ribbon and make those changes. I'm just going to make these bold so they stand out a bit. So if I have data labels on each bar like that, it really means that I don't need this horizontal axis. I can then just simply select it and delete it out, making my chart look a lot cleaner. Maybe I want to make these bars a little bit wider or a little bit narrower. How do we do that? Well, this time we need to right click and we can say Format Data Series. And this allows us to change the gap width so I can make the bars wider or thinner. And there's loads and loads of different formatting options that we have in this right-click menu. And you'll find that with your charts, wherever you're clicked, for example, if I click on this axis just here, if I right-click, I can go in and I have loads of different options in this pane for formatting this axis in different ways. So don't forget, when it comes to adding items to your charts, you've got the little plus icon just here. You can click on the element and you've got some right-click menus, and you also have some contextual ribbons, Pivot Chart Analyze at the top, Design and Format. So many different options. I could select my bars, go up to the Format tab, and I could do things like maybe say, I don't want to fill, but maybe I just want a nice outline around the outside. And I'm going to change the weight of that outline to something like that. Now, in this case, that doesn't look particularly great, but hopefully you get the idea. I can remove the grid lines, select them, press delete, makes it look even cleaner. Now this looks too hideous for me. I need to fill that with something just to feel okay with myself. There we go. That's a bit better. Now, one thing you might also have noticed is that when you create a bar chart, because we've sorted this, notice that the chart shows the actual managers in a different order to what we have in the pivot table. It kind of reverses them in the pivot chart. Now, I'm not sure why it does that. If somebody knows, please tell me. I'm not sure why it does, but it seems to put the one with the lowest value at the top going down to the one with the highest value, even though we've sorted them the other way around. But what we can do is click on the axes, right click and say Format Axes. And in here, right at the bottom, we can choose to show the categories in reverse order. And that just makes them match up with what we have in the pivot table. Okay, now there is loads and loads of formatting that you can apply to tables. I am not going to have time to go through any more about that with you today because there are a couple of other things I want to show you before we finish up. I'm going to run about 5 minutes over. If you need to leave, I fully understand. If you can hold on for 5 more minutes, then please do. The next thing I want to show you is just how you can very simply add interaction into your pivot tables and pivot charts using slicers. And a slicer is basically just a visual filter. So what we can do is we can click on the pivot chart or the pivot table, go up to the Analyze ribbon, and in the filter group here, we can choose to insert a slicer. And we can insert slicers for any column heading that we have in our data. So maybe I want to insert a slicer for, let's say, the store and the town. Click on OK. And it's going to give me these little visual panes that I can put somewhere on my worksheet. And I will say that if you're doing this, you probably want to leave a bit of room, maybe in the column A, to place these slicers. I'm just going to put mine over here. I'm going to resize this one. I'm going to put this one underneath. And I've got loads of towns, so I'm not going to be able to fit them all into this slicer in a nice fashion, but we can scroll through and see them all. Now, these are linked to our pivot charts and our pivot tables. So if I want to filter all of this data and just see the information for Computech, I can simply click on the slicer and it's going to update. I've got a little clear filter button at the top here. I can click on something else. So maybe I want to see the analysis for the store microworld for, let's say, the town Bath. And I can hold down Control and select more than one, 3 different towns like that. So this is a really nice interactive way. So if you send this to other people who aren't particularly familiar with Excel, this makes it really nice and easy for them to filter the data and extract out of it what they're interested in a really nice and visual way. Let's click on the cross and click on the cross again. Okay, again, we could go a lot more into slices, but I'm going to leave it there for the time being. The final thing to show you is simply how we can update all of our pivot table data with the click of one button. So if we go back to our store data, as I mentioned, this store data runs to June 2019. Now this is sales data. So it means that in the month of July, on July the 1st, I'm going to have another bunch of data to add into my data set. And what I've done is I've just put that data on the July data tab. Now, because we put our original data in a table, this is going to be so simple. All we need to do is take our new data and select it all. A quick way to do that is to click inside, Control A to select everything. And we're going to do a copy and a paste. Control C to copy. Let's go back to our store data, click in the last row, Control V to paste that in. Now you might find that you've got your column headings in there. We can simply delete out that row, but effectively this data has become part of the current Excel table. And what that means is that because it is part of the sales data table and all of the pivot tables and pivot charts that we've built are based off of the table name sales data, all we need to do is refresh the pivot table and it will pull through that new data and update the pivot table and the pivot chart. So how do we refresh? Well, we click in the pivot table, we go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and we have a refresh button just here. And if I click on Refresh All, hopefully you saw those numbers changed and the pivot chart updated to reflect that new data as well. Now, if we hadn't put our data into an Excel table, it wouldn't do that. We wouldn't be able to click refresh. We would have to go in and reselect the entire data range, which is a bit of a pain. And that is why it's so important to put your data set inside an Excel table prior to creating your pivot tables.
Don't forget to subscribe to get IT tips, tricks, and training. New videos are uploaded every week, so be sure to click the bell icon to get notified.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's webinar. It's lovely to be back with you this afternoon for this session on advanced pivot tables, tips and tricks. So today we're going to be running through some tips and tricks when it comes to some of the more advanced features of pivot tables. So I'm going to make a small assumption that most of the people attending today have at least some experience of using pivot tables. Now, if you are joining us today and you are more of a beginner, I will say don't worry too much. I am going to run through a quick recap of the basics. I'm just not going to spend too long going through all of the basics of pivot tables because I want to get on to some of the more intermediate to advanced features fairly quickly. Now, I will say that pivot tables is probably the most requested topic that I get in Excel. And for me, that indicates that not only it's the most important tool when it comes to data analysis, but also that people crave additional knowledge as there is so much that you can do with them. And sometimes it's not completely obvious how you utilize some of the features within pivot tables. So we've got an hour, so I can't go through absolutely everything. As always, I've cherry-picked a few things, and as always, I will be trying to throw in as many keyboard shortcuts and little helpful pro tips as we go through. So let's take a look at our agenda. So as I mentioned, I am going to do a little bit of a pivot tables recap, which isn't really going to extend too much beyond creating a pivot table from scratch. I'm going to talk a little bit about formatting values and also custom pivot table styles. We're going to take a look at sorting and filtering pivot data and also creating and formatting pivot charts. I'm going to go through some of the options like summarizing values and also showing values as something else, which you may or may not have used before. And something that's quite fun that I thought I'd throw in because it does showcase quite a few different elements. It showcases slicers and also some of the newer functions, and that is creating dynamic pivot chart labels. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about using calculated fields, and we're also going to do some work with slicers. So that is our agenda. I'm going to try and get through as much of it as I can. And not waffle on too much, which I do have a tendency to do. So let's jump out of here and I'm going to switch across to the Excel spreadsheet that we're going to be using today. Now, just on a side note, I have dropped this spreadsheet into the chat pane, which you may or may not have seen. So if you do want to try and follow along with me, then please feel free to download that file and you can try and work along with me. If not, if I go a bit too fast, remember that this is being recorded and you can always use the recording and the practice file after this session. All right, so let's start out with the basics. So I have some data here, and it's not a particularly large data set. If I do Control down arrow to jump me to the last row, you can see that I have 702 rows of data. So not completely huge, but enough data for what we need to do today. I'm going to do Control up arrow to jump back up to the top. And what we have here is basically sales data for some products across a few different countries. And you can see here we have units sold, we have various different prices, we have some data that is primed for a pivot table. Now, currently, I don't have this data in a table. Now, my data is clean. I'm not going to go through the process of cleaning up data. We've done that in a webinar previously, which you can find on the Simon Says It YouTube channel if you want to learn how you can clean up your data prior to putting it into a pivot table. But the one thing I am going to do here is put this data into a table, one of the most important steps before you create your pivot table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to press Control A to highlight all of my data. Now, when it comes to formatting as a table, there are a few different options that you can use. You can go to your home ribbon, and in the styles group, you have a format as table drop down. So you can come in and you can select any one of these. A quicker way of doing it is to press the keyboard shortcut Control T, which is basically the create table shortcut. It's going to say, where is your table data? Now, I selected mine prior, so it's picking up all of my data. I'm going to say, yes, my table has headers, click on OK, and that's now put my data into a table. Now, when I'm clicked in my table, you can see that I get my table design contextual ribbon. And this is one of the reasons why I know that my data is in a table. And the first thing that I always like to do is I like to name my table. So in this first group where we have table name, instead of the generic table 1, which isn't particularly meaningful, I'm going to change this to, let's say, product underscore data. Remember, when you are naming your tables or your pivot tables, you can't have any spaces in that table name. It has to be separated with an underscore, or you need to make it all one word. And don't forget to press enter, which is something I always forget to do in order to set that table name. So now I've done that, I'm going to put this data into a pivot table. Again, there are a few different ways that you can do this. You can jump up to Insert and select Pivot Table. But if you're already on the Table Design ribbon, you also have a Summarize with Pivot Table option just here, which is the one that I'm going to use. And you can see here it's picked up my product data range for my pivot table, which is fine. And I'm going to put this on a new worksheet and click on OK. So now we have a blank pivot table report. And for those of you that have used pivot tables before, this is probably fairly straightforward and easy for you so far. Now you'll see at the bottom, this is just called sheet 1. I'm going to move this to the right-hand side of my data, just because I prefer it organized with my raw data first and then any of my pivot table worksheets afterwards. And currently I don't have anything in this pivot table. I've got my pivot table fields over on the right hand side. And just a reminder that these pivot table fields are literally all of the column headings from your raw data. And to build my pivot table, I'm going to use these fields and drag them into these various areas underneath in order to build up my pivot table. So the first pivot table that I'm going to build is going to be, I want to see a list of all of the sales by product. So I'm going to grab my sales field, I'm going to drag it down and drop it into values. I'm going to grab my product field and I'm going to drop that down into rows. And you can see what that's done. I now have my products listed just here. And then I have the sum of all of the sales for those products, I should say, listed just there. Now, one thing you will notice when you drop sales into values, you can see that it's automatically done a sum of sales. Now, depending on the data that you're dropping into this values area, sometimes it might do a count, sometimes it might do a sum. And for me, it's decided that sum is the best one for this particular set of values. But what I could do is if I wanted to see maybe the number of items sold as opposed to the total value of sales, I could change this to count instead of sum. And there's a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can right click, I can go down to summarize values by, and I can change this to count. So that's going to show me the number of items I've sold, the number of products, as opposed to the value sum. Okay. I'm going to Control Z to come back out of there. The other way I could do this would be from this pivot table fields pane. So where I have sum of sales, if I click that little drop down arrow and go to value field settings, I could then choose count from there. And that's also going to change it to count. All right. So very straightforward. Control Z to come back out of there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename some of these column headings. So I'm going to widen these columns out a little bit. Now, these little headings up here, you don't have to keep what Excel names them. So if I wanted to, I could jump in here and just overtype with the name product and hit enter. And maybe I want to change sum of sales to say total sales. Okay, so don't be afraid to rename those column headings. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to do some formatting to this pivot table. And I've widened my columns out here a little bit, so I've got more room to work with. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to format these numbers so that they look a little bit nicer. So these are values, they are monetary values. So I probably want to have a currency symbol on the front of these. Now, remember, when you're formatting these numbers, you might have a tendency to select them all, go to the home ribbon, and then use your number formatting in the middle here. Now, it will work, it will apply, but remember that when you're working in a pivot table and you're moving fields around, when you apply this number formatting, it's going to apply it to the cells. So it might not necessarily move with your numbers if you start moving your fields around. So a much better way to do this to guarantee that you always have your currency symbol kept with your numbers is to right click, go down to value field settings and select number format from here and then select the number formatting that you want. So in this case, I'm going to say accounting. I'm going to leave my symbol on US dollars and I am going to take those decimal places down to 0. Click on OK. And click on OK again. And now I have my formatting applied. Now, I don't know if you noticed there, as soon as I applied that formatting, column B suddenly got a lot narrower. I'd widened this column out quite a way, but the column got narrower as soon as I changed that formatting. Now, this is something to watch out for if you don't like that. So sometimes if you set all of your columns to a certain width and then you make a change and the columns resize themselves, sometimes that can be a little bit annoying. Now, you can control that just by modifying one of the options within Pivot Tables. So if we click in our data, go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and right in this first group underneath Options, on the Layout and Format tab here, you'll see at the bottom there's an option that says Auto Fit Column Widths on Update. So if you have that ticked, and I think for most people that will be ticked by default, it means that every time you make a change, Excel is going to change the column width so that it just fits in, it accommodates what you have within that particular cell. Now, if you set your columns to a specific width and you want to retain that, it's worth unticking this little option just here. And that column width is always going to stay the same. Now, you'll see in a moment the drawback of doing that, but I just wanted to highlight that little option because that is a question that I've been asked quite a lot when I've been training pivot tables. All right, so let's add another field in, and immediately you're going to see why sometimes doing that little option is not a good idea. So I'm going to go back to my fields, and I'm going to grab date, and I'm going to drop this down into columns. Now, immediately you can see that I have all of these hash symbols in here, and that's because the column isn't wide enough to accommodate whatever needs to go in there. Okay, and that is the drawback of essentially fixing your column widths. So what I'm probably going to do here is I'm going to widen my column widths manually, and I'm going to go back in and I'm just going to turn that option back on. Okay, so you've seen both sides of the coin there. It's up to you to decide if you like that option or if you don't. Now, one other thing that you've might have noticed is that when I've dropped that date field into columns, I've got a whole host of other things. So it's not only added date, it's added a quarters field and a years field. Now, I didn't have a quarters field and a years field in my field list just here. But what Excel does is that if you have something like a date field, it looks at that date field and it says, okay, can I break this down into years, quarters, days? And if it can, it's going to give you those additional fields. And if you take a look at my pivot table, you can see now I have years listed at the top, 2018, 2019, and I have little plus icons next to them. And when I expand, I'm now seeing my data in quarters. And I can click the plus next to these just to widen them out, and then I get to see the different months underneath. So I can essentially drill down through the years, the quarters, and then into months. Now I'm going to collapse these back up again, and a quick way of doing that is if you go up to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, in this little active field group, you have these two little buttons here, collapse and expand field. So I'm going to say collapse. To collapse those back up again, I'm going to say collapse again to get back to my years. Now, it might be that you just literally wanted the months listed there. And when you added that field, Excel added in all of these extra fields, which you don't feel that you need. And that is absolutely fine. You can just get rid of any of the fields that you don't want. So I'm going to drag years out of here and also quarters. So I just get my dates showing in months, which is kind of what I wanted originally. Okay, so just be aware of that grouping. Now, actually, if I go back one level, hang on a second, I'm going to Control Z and Control Z again, because there's just one more thing I want to show you here. If when you have your items grouped like this, if you go up to Group Field, this is actually going to show you what it's going to add when you drag your date down. So mine's going to add months, quarters, and years. Now, if when I drag date, I want it to show just quarters and years, I can come in here and I can select that. Okay, so this little group field will show you what fields you're going to get basically when you drag your date down to there. All right, so I'm going to switch this back to just showing months like so. All right, so that just explains a little bit about how Excel deals with grouping. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rearrange my data fields a little bit. I'm going to drag date down into rows, and I think I'm going to put product into columns like so. So now I have my products running across the top, I have my months or my date running down the side, and then I have my values in the middle. And what you can probably see just here is that for one of these products, I have a lot of 0 values. So for Marchesa, it looks like we only sold something in September, and the rest of these cells are blank. Now, if you start to do things like maybe create pivot charts based on this data, or maybe do things like spark lines, you'll find that having nothing in a cell can sometimes throw your data off, make your data look a little bit weird. I always think that if you have 0 values or nothing in particular cells, it's always worth filling them with something, whether it's a 0 or even some text if you wanted to. I wouldn't have absolutely nothing in those cells. So a quick way of doing this, again, is to go up to your Pivot Table Analyze ribbon. In the first group, we have Options. And again, on this Layout and Format tab, towards the bottom underneath Format, you can see here it says for empty cells, show, and then you can put in here what you want them to show. So that might be a piece of text. You might want it to say no data. In my case, I'm just going to say put a 0 in instead, which is just going to put a dash essentially there. Okay, so that means that it's still a value in there, so it's not going to, you're not going to get weird breaks in your spark lines or your charts or anything along those lines. Okay, so always good to add some kind of formatting to your 0 values. Now, what I'm going to do here is I've got my pivot table. It looks reasonably good. I'm going to go in and I'm going to name my pivot table. So again, up to Pivot Table Analyze, in the first group, I just have the generic name of Pivot Table 1. Now, I always recommend, even though it does seem a little bit tedious, that you go through and you name any tables that you create, any pivot charts, any pivot tables. This is particularly important when you start to get into things like building dashboards, adding slicers, because if you've got quite a lot of pivot tables going on and quite a lot of pivot charts, you're going to need to be able to identify those charts. So if you give them a name, it's a lot easier to identify them. Otherwise, they're just going to be called Pivot Table 1, Pivot Table 2, so on and so forth. So I'm going to name this pivot table. What shall we call this? We will call this sales by product, like so, and enter. All right. Let's turn our focus a little bit towards design. And this tends to be something that people don't think about a great deal, but it is really important, particularly when it comes to the readability of your pivot table. Now, my pivot table is reasonably small, and I'm sure that I've seen very, very complex, large pivot tables. And the easier we can make it for people to interpret, understand, and analyze, the better. And sometimes formatting can really help with that. So it is worth thinking about. It's not just a pretty afterthought. It can help with the readability. Now, when it comes to formatting your pivot table, if we jump up to the design ribbon up here, we have numerous different options. So I can go into pivot table styles and I have different designs, different colors that I can apply to my pivot table. Now that's all well and good, but I am kind of limited to the options that Excel has decided I might want to use. It might also be that if you work for a company that maybe has some kind of house style or some kind of branding, and it's really important to them that you use specific colors even in your pivot tables and charts, then you might want to create your own pivot table style where you can utilize your own colors. And you can do that from here. At the bottom, you have New Pivot Table Style. And this is where you can go in and you can customize every element of the pivot table to your liking. Now, I'm not going to go through and do all of these. I'm just going to show you a few different options and show you where it goes and how you apply it. So I'm going to call this just my initials and custom style. I then get to select different table elements. So you can see we've got a whole table, report filter labels, first column, header row, and you can customize each of these elements. So I might want to say that for my whole table, I'm going to click on Format. I want the background of this table to be a light grey colour. I might also say that I want an outline border around the outside of the entire table. I might then say that I want the, let's say, header row. I'm going to format that. I'm going to say I want that a green color and click on OK. And I'm going to go down to grand total row. I want that grand total row to be bold. And click on OK. Now, I've just made a few changes there. You could go through every single one of these, changing the font color, font style, background fill, all of that, borders, everything. I'm just going to do a few little things there. Click on OK. And once you've done that, if you want to now apply that style that you've created, if you jump up to Pivot Table Styles, you'll see that you now have an additional group at the top called Custom. So any custom styles you create will appear up here. And I can then just select it, and I now have my custom style applied to my pivot table. Now, another question that I get asked really frequently is, if you create a custom style in one workbook and then you create yourself a new workbook, does that custom style carry across to the new workbook? And the answer there is, unfortunately, no, it doesn't. This is very specific to the workbook that you're working in. So I can utilize it on other worksheets, but I can't utilize it in different workbooks. So if you do want to use your custom style in a completely different workbook, the workaround for this is to come into this workbook and essentially copy the pivot table into the new workbook. As soon as you do that, when you go into Pivot Table Styles, you'll see that that style is then available. So you can apply it to your new pivot table in the new workbook and then delete out that pivot table that you copied across. Hopefully that makes sense. That is the workaround for getting that style to copy across to a new workbook. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. All right, let's now add in something else. We're going to add in another field. I'm going to add, what shall we add here? I'm going to add country, and I'm going to drop that down into rows. I'm actually going to put that above date, so it's organized like this. Now, another little thing you can do with regards to formatting is that you can add a blank row in between each change in item. And sometimes this can help quite a lot with the readability of your pivot tables. So again, on this design ribbon, you have a blank rows option. If you click the drop down, I can say insert blank line after each item, and it's going to put a blank line in there. So it just separates it out. Now, with this style that I've applied, it's not particularly too obvious. So I might actually go in and let's change this to something else. What shall we do? Something like that. So now you can see that blank line a little bit clearer, and it just gives a little bit of separation to each item in your data. Hopefully that's all making sense to everybody so far. All right, now I'm going to, let's remove date. And I'm also going to remove product from here. So we just get back to our countries. Actually, I'm going to remove country and replace that with product. So we have our product and our total sales listed. Now, when it comes to things like sorting and filtering within your pivot tables, there's quite a few different things that you can do here. So currently, I don't have these sorted, but if I did want to sort my value so that I had the product with the highest amount of sales at the top, all I need to do is right-click, go to sort, and I can sort largest to smallest. So I can see there that the Vermont product is my top seller, essentially. Now, something else that I can do here is if I wanted to see maybe just the top 3 products, I could apply a top 10 filter. So if we click on product drop down, go to values, you'll see right at the bottom here in my filters, I have this filter for top 10. Now, if you had lots and lots and lots of different products, you might want to see what the top 10 products were by sales. I don't, I only have a few. So I want to see what the top 3 products are. So I can take that down, click on OK, and it's going to show me those top 3 products. Okay, again, hopefully that makes sense to everyone. All right, so I'm actually going to clear this filter out. And am I going to do it by product this time? Yeah, I think I'm going to stay by doing this with product. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a pivot chart, and I'm going to show you some options that you have when it comes to your pivot charts. So I'm going to jump up to my pivot table analyze ribbon, and you'll see on this ribbon you have an option for a pivot chart. So let's click on pivot chart. I have a whole host of different charts that I can select, but I'm just going to do a very basic column chart in this example. Now I'm going to do a little bit of basic formatting on here. Now, when you insert your charts, you're going to get these little gray filter buttons. So these help you filter essentially directly from your chart. Now, I don't tend to use these filters. I tend to filter using my pivot table over here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all field buttons on charts. Generally, when I'm creating my charts, I like to keep them as clean as possible. I don't like to have lots of unnecessary things on my chart. I like people to be able to see exactly the data that I want them to see. Now, looking at my chart, one thing I also don't need on here for this particular data series is I don't really need my total over in the legend. It's not really performing any kind of function. Now, this is just a text box, so I can click on it, press delete, and get rid of that little text box. I'm going to add a quick title, so double click in my chart title, and I'm going to call this Sales by Product, like so. And I'm going to make this chart a little bit flatter, so these bars are a little bit flatter, and widen that out a little bit. Now, when it comes to formatting your pivot charts, you have a whole host of different options. Now, one thing I will say is you need to be careful where you're clicked on your chart when it comes to formatting. And one good way to keep track of where you're clicked is if you go up to your pivot chart format ribbon, which is now displaying at the top. In the first group, it will show you where you're currently clicked. So I'm clicked on the outside of my chart, so it's telling me I'm clicked in the chart area. If I click on where the grid lines are, you can see that that changes to plot area. If I click on my data bars, it's showing me it's clicked on the total series. So this really matters when it comes to formatting, because I can't tell you how many times I think I'm formatting my data bars and I'm clicked on the plot area. Okay, so you can, if you want to, select the part of the chart you want to format from this drop down as well. Sometimes people find that a little bit easier just to select it from here. Now I'm going to apply a little bit of formatting to what we have. I'm going to click on these data bars and I'm going to change the color just by using the palette. I'm going to change those to red. Now, if I want to make some other changes specifically to this data series, I can right click and you'll find that I have more options underneath Format Data Series. So anything on your chart, if you right click, you're going to have more options in the right click menu. And you can see here, I can choose to change the gap width of my bars. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to essentially make my bars a little bit wider by changing the gap width. And click on OK. Now, another thing I might want to do here is, because I like to remove lots of information just to keep it nice and clean, I'm going to remove this axis, these values in this axis, by clicking delete. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to add those values as data labels on my chart. So I'm going to jump up to the design ribbon. And if you want to add what we call a chart element, we have this first option just here where we can do things like add axes titles, chart titles, so on and so forth. So if you want to label up your chart with the values, you can select Data Labels and choose where you want those values to sit. Now I'm going to have mine on the outside end, and that kind of really gets rid of the need for having that axis running down the side. And I can very clearly see that data and the values. So just a few little formatting tips that you have there. Now, another thing you might want to do when it comes to formatting your charts is you can do things like add pictures, you can add patterns, just to add interest to your chart. We want to make our charts nice and visual, but we don't want to add so much formatting that it's overwhelming or too busy and we lose the point of the data. But I'm just going to show you very quickly how you can work with textures just to make this chart a little bit more interesting. Again, I'm going to click on this plot area. I'm going to right click and I'm going to say Format Plot Area. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a fill. I'm going to add a picture or texture fill. So if I wanted to put a picture in the background here, I could choose to insert a picture that I have saved off locally. I'm actually going to add a texture, and I'm just going to choose this one just here. And I'm going to adjust the transparency to take that all the way down. So it's just very faint. It's not distracting from the data, but it just makes it a little bit more interesting, like so. I then might decide that I want to actually change this chart area background, go up to Format, Shape Fill, and I'm going to give that just a light grey colour just there. So slightly more interesting to look at than it was at the beginning. Now, you could go to town with this. I'm not going to linger too much longer on chart formatting, but in case you haven't seen these used in charts before, there is a newer feature called icons. And if you go to the insert ribbon, you have icons underneath illustrations. I've seen a lot of people using icons in their charts these days. So I'm going to just do a quick search for, let's say, money. And I'm actually not money. Let's add shopping in there, make it a bit more relevant. And let's just add this little shopping cart icon. Click on insert. I'm going to resize this down just by holding down shift and dragging in that corner. And I might want to add that as a little point of interest onto my chart. Now, mine doesn't look amazing where I've put it, but I've seen these used really nicely and effectively in charts and also for interactive dashboards as well. So expand your mind a little bit when it comes to creativity when you're working with your pivot charts. Okay, let's move on to the next item. Now, I'm going to create essentially a copy of this worksheet. And if I'm creating lots of different pivot tables and pivot charts, I quite like to use this method. Instead of going back to my data and creating another pivot chart from here, or pivot table from here, I should say, sometimes if I already have one, I just like to copy the worksheet. So a quick way of doing that is to go down to where it says Sheet 1, hold down Control, drag and drop, and that's going to make a copy of that particular worksheet. Now, I'm going to just go back and name this one so I don't get confused. This is sales by product, like so. And I'm not sure what I'm going to name this one yet, but I am going to delete out the table. Okay, so now I have a new copy. Now what I want to talk through is how you can use things like summarizing values and showing values as. Now what I mean by this is you can add data into your pivot table that essentially doesn't exist in the original source data. So currently I'm looking at my different products and I'm looking at the total sales for those products. But what if I wanted to see what the average sales are for these products? Well, I can do that. All I need to do is grab my sales field again. I'm going to drag it down and drop it in values. So you can essentially add the same field multiple times into the same area. And what I could then choose to do is I could right click and say summarize values by, and I want to see the average. Okay. Now, this looks different to this column because I haven't applied the same number formatting, and you have to go back in every single time, unfortunately, and apply the relevant number formatting. So for me, that's a counting format. I'm going to take that down to 0, like so. And I might want to change this to just average sales, like so. So very quickly, I've added in something which isn't in the original source data, the average sales. I could do the same thing as we saw earlier for count. I could add another sales field down here. I can right click, I can say summarize values by, and I can see the count, which is going to give me the number of items that I've sold. And again, I might want to change this to count sales. Okay. Now, something else I could do here is I could do something like, let's drag another sales field down here. I might choose to, or I might want to have this showing as the percentage of the total. So I might want to see what percentage each of these products make up of the total. So again, I just need to right click. And this time I'm going to go down to show values as. And in here, I have all different calculations that I can perform. So I can do things like see the difference from certain fields. I can see the percentage of the row total. But for this one, I'm going to say I want to see what the percentage is of the grand total. And there we go. Now, again, I'm going to jump in and I'm just going to reformat this a little bit. I'm going to right click down to value field settings, into number format. And this time we're dealing with a percentage. And what I want to do here is just take these decimal places down to 0. So now I can very clearly see that Vermont makes up 28% of all sales and Marquesa makes up 1% of all sales. All right, so very quickly I've managed to add in all of these different fields which weren't necessarily part of my original data. So my analysis has got a lot deeper simply by knowing a few commands in Excel. Hopefully that makes sense to everyone. I know I'm going reasonably quickly. It's quite a lot to take in. Now, something else you might want to do here, and this again is just touching on something that you may have used previously, and that is conditional formatting. Now, you can use conditional formatting within your pivot tables, but you need to apply it in a slightly different way than if you were applying it to just maybe a regular table or just a list of numbers. So if I wanted to apply conditional formatting to any of these fields, or maybe this total sales field, what I would need to do would be to, I'm going to highlight this field just here. I'm going to select the top one in total sales. I'm going to go to conditional formatting, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, let's do a new rule. Now, the reason why I'm doing it this way is that when you do a new rule, this is going to be the option that you need to select, all cells showing total sales values for products. Now, you don't get this when you're just applying conditional formatting to data that's not within a pivot table. So you want to select this bottom option, and then you can go in and select the conditional formatting that you want to use. So it might be that I want to use, let's say, a data bar. And I'm going to say OK, and it's going to apply that to this particular area that I've selected. And it doesn't matter whether I move these fields around, that conditional formatting is going to move with the total sales. Okay, so you have to apply it in a slightly different way to what you would if it was just outside of a pivot table. Control Z to backtrack out of there. Now, something else that's quite interesting that you can do with your data, and this is along the same line of adding in fields that don't necessarily, or data that doesn't necessarily exist in your original data, is you can use something called calculated fields. Now, calculated fields allow you to perform calculations with your pivot table data using the fields, okay? Now, the easiest way for me to show you this is to just jump straight in to an example. Now, what I'm actually going to do here is I'm going to go back to Pivot Table Analyze. Now, you can see that I've lost my pivot table field list just here. Now, if that ever happens to you and it doesn't come back when you click inside your pivot table, you just need to click this field list button on the end here in the show group to bring your pivot table fields list back again. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to remove some of these fields that I created. Just take all of those out. So I just get back to my product and my total sales. Now, what I might want to do, and I'm not sure how realistic of an example this particularly is, but I might want to say that for all sales that are over, let's say 27 million, I want to apply a 20% sales tax. So this is where I would utilize calculated fields. Now, the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually sort my data. I'm going to sort it largest to smallest. So essentially, because this data set is quite small, I can see that these values are all over 27 million and these ones are under 27 million. So what I would expect is that once I've done this calculated field, I would expect to see what the sales tax is for these top ones, but not for these ones because they're going to fall under 27 million. So let's go in and add our calculated field. I'm going to jump up to Pivot Table Analyze, go to Fields, Items and Sets, and add a calculated field. So the first thing we need to do here is we need to have a name for our new field. Now, this is going to be a 20% sales tax, so I'm going to call this sales. We then need to construct our formula. So there's numerous different formulas that you can use in calculated fields. And whilst this isn't a training session on Excel formulas and functions, just be aware that you can use them within here. The only difference is if you were using a formula or a function outside of calculated fields, if you're just using, I don't know, equals sum, then you would probably utilize cell references in order to construct your formula. Now, with a calculated field, you can't do that. You can't use cell references. You have to use your pivot table fields. So sometimes this takes a little bit of thought, but we can do it in this particular example. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to utilize an if statement or an if function to say if, open bracket. Now, if you have never used the if function before, then this might be a little bit confusing for you. But with the if function, the first argument is we need to perform a logical test. So what do I want to say here? I want to say if the sales total is greater than or equal to 27 million. That's my first logical test. So I'm going to say if, and I'm going to use my field. I'm going to use the sales field. If sales is greater than or equal to 27 million, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, comma. The next part of this formula is what I want Excel to do if that particular thing is true. So if the value is greater than or equal to 27 million, I want Excel to do the sales multiplied by 20%. Comma. If that's not true, so if it's under, I want it to do nothing. Okay, now that is a very basic if statement. And again, if you've never used them before, then that might be something that you want to look up. But I just really want to show you how you can utilize it within calculated fields. So now when I click on OK, you can see I now get a new column and it's worked out that sales tax for everything that's above 27 million and for everything that's under, I have nothing in there. And I could come in here and change that just to say sales tax if I wanted to. Now, if you get this little message pop up, pivot table field name already exists when you're renaming, all you need to do is you can cheat a little bit here, put a space on the end, hit enter, and Excel thinks you've typed in a completely different heading name. Now, I could go a stage further here and then just do an addition of the total sales and the sales tax. So again, I can utilize a calculated field. I'm going to call this total including tax. This is going to be a straightforward sum. So we're going to say sales plus. The good thing about this is that as soon as you create a calculated field, it's now available as a field for you to use. So I can say sales tax, okay, and then I get that totals column at the end. So I've been able to do a greater analysis of my pivot table data, again, just by knowing a few little tips and tricks to really get what I want to see out of my data. Hopefully that's all making sense. We've covered a lot in there. I understand completely if your mind is a little bit, ooh, what's going on? I would recommend that you do go through this webinar again with the worksheet, and you can pause it and stop it and kind of really take stock of what you're doing as you go along. Now we're going to move on, and just bear with me 1 second. I just need to take a sip of water. There we go. Now we've got about 10 minutes or so left, and I really do want to get to showing you dynamic chart labels, because again, this is something that I get asked about quite a lot. Now I'm going to, where should we do this? I'm going to stay on this spreadsheet, and I'm going to remove some of these things that we've added. And I am just going to have, let's see, do I want my rows, my product? Yes, I do. So I'm going to stick with this data that I have just here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do exactly what we did previously. I'm going to create a very quick pivot chart. And I'm not going to do anything fancy with this particular pivot chart. I'm going to do a bog standard column chart again. I'm just going to remove these little labels, remove this just here, like so. And I'm going to leave it at that. The main point of this section is not really formatting the chart, it's using dynamic labels. Now, you might be wondering what a dynamic label is. Well, what it is basically, I'm going to add a slicer in here in a moment. And in fact, let's do that first of all. I'm going to add a little slicer. And if you've never used slicers previously, these are basically like filters, which will help you filter your pivot table and your pivot chart. And you'll see when I've tried to insert a slicer, we get all of our column headings in here, and we can literally choose which ones we want to add slicers for. Now, for me, I'm going to add, I think we're going to add a country slicer. And click on OK. I'm going to drag this over here and just make that a little bit tidier. So what we're going to do here is, or what I'm aiming for, is that I want to be able to make a selection in this slicer and have the chart title update. So I want this chart to basically say sales by product, and then underneath I want it to say Brazil, or maybe India, or maybe Japan, or maybe a combination of whatever I have selected in this slicer. So you'll see when I click on Brazil, my pivot table and my pivot chart update, and it's now only showing the sales for Brazil. I can select multiple items. I can select Brazil and India, and now I'm seeing that data reflected in my pivot table and pivot chart. So essentially, my title needs to look at this slicer, see what I've selected, and update itself depending on what my selection is. And that is what we call a dynamic chart label. Okay, so I'm going to show you how to put one together, and I'm going to try and do this reasonably quickly. I will say this process looks reasonably lengthy, and it is definitely one you need to practice a few times. Now, the way that I like to do this, or the way that I find it easiest, is I like to create a new little worksheet, and I'm going to call this Helper. Sometimes I like to put in these little helper worksheets where I do kind of all the messy work, and then I can copy it back to the sheet that I want to use, essentially. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do here is, in fact, I'm going to add some titles so I know what I'm looking at. I'm going to add the word slicer up here. And then I'm going to add, let's add the word title, subtitle, and then I'm going to say pivot table down here. So this is my helper worksheets where I'm going to be doing all of my working out. So I'm going to jump back to my charts, and I'm going to grab this slicer. I'm going to do a Control X to cut it. and I'm going to paste it onto my helper worksheet. I'm just going to place it underneath there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a little pivot table, and all this pivot table is going to show is basically the information that I have in this slicer. Okay, so I'm going to jump all the way back to my original data. I'm going to go to Table Design, Summarize with Pivot Table, and this time I'm going to put my pivot table on an existing worksheet. And that existing worksheet is going to be Helper. I'm going to put it down here in cell A22 and click on OK. So this is going to give me a blank pivot table, and the only field I'm going to put in here, as I said, is the country field. So I'm going to grab country and I'm going to put it down into columns so that I now have my country running across here. I'm going to close that down. You can see that by default, I have grand total on the end here. I'm going to just turn that off by jumping back up to Design, going to Grand Totals and saying Off for rows and columns. So this is what I wanted. I basically wanted my country names just listed in a row like this. Okay. Now I know this appears very confusing at the moment. Hopefully it will all be tied together in a second. So now that I have set this up, what I want to do is I want to create a title and a subtitle that's going to be used on my chart. So the first title that I want is I want this chart to say sales by product. So that's fairly simple. I'm just going to add in here sales by product. Straightforward. And what we're going to do in a moment is we're essentially going to link the chart title to pick up this sales by product. But what I want is underneath sales by product, I want the subtitle to be whatever country I have selected in this slicer. Now that could be Brazil, it could be India, it could be Japan, it could be any combination of all of these. I might have Brazil, UK and USA selected. So this is where we need to use a little function. And for this, and let me zoom in a little bit so you can see it a little bit clearer, I'm going to use a new function that's available in Excel, and this is available in Excel 2019 and also Office 365. Now, I will point out an alternative if you're using an earlier version, but this is a good demonstration of one of the brand new functions that we have available in Excel, and it's called text join. And what this does is it's very similar to concatenate. And in fact, concatenate would be what you would use if you don't have access to this text join function in the version of Excel that you're using. And what concatenate and text join do is they allow you to essentially join pieces of text together. So I'm going to open my bracket. The first argument I have here is delimiter. Now, a delimiter is where I specify how I want each word separated. So in my subtitle, if I've selected Brazil, India, and Japan, how do I want those words separated? Do I want a space in between? Do I want a comma? Do I want something else? Now, for me, I want those words separated by a comma and then a space. So my first argument here, I need to put it in quote marks, is comma, space, quote mark. My next argument is, do I want Excel to ignore empty cells? Now, I'm going to type in true here. I'm going to come back to this in a moment after we've done the third argument because I think it will make a little bit more sense. Comma. And now I need to select this row just here, which contains my column labels essentially. So what I'm saying here is I've specified my delimiter, how I want these spaced out in the title. I've told the subtitle to use whatever I have listed in here, because remember this is a pivot table that's controlled by this slicer. So whatever I select up here, this is going to change, okay? And because I've selected the entire row, I've said to Excel to ignore empty cells. That is what this true argument is, because I've got the whole row selected and a lot of these cells are empty, okay? Close my bracket, hit enter. And like magic, we have Brazil, India, Japan, UK, USA. So what I would expect to happen here is if I start clicking around on my slicer, I would expect this subtitle to change. Now let's click. It doesn't change. Now, why is that? Well, it's because we haven't actually linked this slicer to this pivot table. I'm going to click on my slicer, up to the slicer ribbon, and we have a report connections button. And this is where you can go in and you can start linking your slicer to the different pivot tables. And this is going to show you any pivot tables and pivot charts that you have in your workbook. So just for quickness, I'm going to just select both, click on OK. And now when I click, can you see it's changing down here because this is controlling the pivot table and the pivot table is linked to the subtitle. So now I can select multiple things and we have them with a comma space in between. All right. So now that we've done all that, we can essentially jump back to our title over here. I'm going to click in the chart title at the top. I'm going to say equals in the formula bar. And I'm going to select title. So now it says sales by product. And I want to have the country appearing underneath. So what I'm going to do here is insert a text box. And we're just going to put this, let's make this quite large, somewhere underneath. And again, click in the formula bar, type in equals. I'm going to go back to here, select the cell, enter, and it's going to give me those names. Now I can do some fiddling around here. I might want to put it underneath, and I'm going to move this plot area down so we have a bit more room. And if you want to center these, there isn't really a great way of centering them. You just kind of have to make this text box the length or the width of the chart, and then you can center them on the page, give it a little bit more room. And of course you can jump in here and you can start formatting this title, making it look really nice. So the final thing I'd do here would be to copy this slicer back onto the other page. So Control X to cut. I'm going to copy it back over here. Now hopefully what we should see is if I click India, it's going to change. So we now have a dynamic chart title happening, which I think is actually pretty cool. And yeah, I wanted to show that to you because it utilized a few different things. We got to see some charts, we got to see some slices in action, and we also got to see that new function of text join. Again, this is something which you might need to practice that a little bit, but once you've got it clear in your head, it's actually reasonably simple. Now, I will say that once you've done all this working out on your little helper area, you can't delete this worksheet because everything is linked to here essentially. But what you could do is you could go through and just hide that particular worksheet so no one can see all of your workings out. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this month for today's webinar, which is using the data model to create a pivot table. And this is actually a really nice follow-on session from the webinar that we did last month, where we took a look at basically creating pivot tables from scratch, always a popular topic. Now, if you didn't attend last month, don't worry at all. It isn't a prerequisite to be able to follow this particular session. But I will say that if you do have a basic knowledge of pivot tables, then this is going to help you out a lot in this session as we go through it. I am going to do a quick recap of creating a basic pivot table, not using the data model at the beginning. So that will give you, it will be very brief, but it will give you a bit of an idea if you're not used to creating pivot tables or not as familiar with that. Now, the reason why I'm going to start out with just creating a basic pivot table is because it illustrates really nicely why we might want to use the data model to create our pivot tables instead. Now, before we get on to all of that, I do have quite a bit of housekeeping today. So let's run through that very quickly. Now, for those of you that are new to our training sessions, I know we do get a lot of regulars, so I apologize if you see this every single month. But for anybody who is new, let me just introduce myself. So my name is Deborah Ashby, and I'm an IT trainer and Microsoft subject matter expert. And I've been a trainer for a pretty long time, about 16 years now, and I've worked in the wider IT industry, not necessarily in training, for a total of about 25 years. It always makes me feel really old when I say that. And it is my absolute pleasure to be hosting this webinar for you today on my favorite subject, which is basically Excel pivot tables. I am going to provide you with the files that I'm going to be using throughout this session. And I know a lot of people do find that I go through a bit too quick for them in the webinar, and they like to go back and rewatch it at their own pace with the course files. So I definitely encourage you to do that if you want to. And for this specific lesson, there's quite a few files, and the way that you save them is going to be quite important. If you can see my desktop just here, I have a folder here called transaction data. If I double click inside that, I have transactions 2019 and 2020, and then I have the other files that we're going to be using outside of that folder simply on my desktop. What I want to do now is just quickly walk you through today's agenda. What are we going to do with all of those files that we've just downloaded? Well, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about what exactly is the data model and why do we use it. Now, I found that the best way to understand this is to start with a basic example of a pivot table report. So again, if you attended the session last month, then we ran through pivot tables, but in this I am going to show you how we can build a basic pivot table report. And during that, I'm going to show you the difference between doing a basic pivot table report from one data source and using the data model. What we're then going to do is we're going to open up some of those files that I've sent through to you so that we can understand exactly what we're looking at, the data that we're using, and why we're using so many different files in this session. We're then going to move on to importing our data in using get and transform. And I'm going to show you how you can link to a specific folder, which is going to make your life a lot easier when it comes to adding data to and updating your pivot tables later on. We're going to talk a little bit about the Power Query editor. We're not going to linger too much on that because it is an entire topic in its own right, but we will take a quick look at that. I'm going to show you how you can do things like combine multiple files together and then how you can add data to the data model. We're going to take a look at creating relationships between different tables of data and then how we can use all of our data to create what we call a consolidated pivot table. We're going to finish out the session by creating a pivot chart based off of the data model, and then I'm going to show you how easy it is to update the data. Now, if you've never used data models before, then most of that agenda is probably not going to make too much sense to you. Things like get and transform, Power Query, combining, what does this all mean? It is going to become clear as we work our way through. So let's start out with that first initial question. What is the data model and why do we use it? Now, as I said, to illustrate this, we're going to start out by building a basic pivot table report. And we're going to use one of the files that we've downloaded. So I'd like you to go to your desktop and first of all, open up the file called sales2020.xlsx. And it's this one just here. So I'll just give you a couple of seconds to orientate yourselves, because a lot of information in the first 5 minutes. All right. So once you've got that open, this is basically just some data that relates to different sales. So we've got in column A, we have order ID, then we have customer ID, trip name. So this is sales data related to holidays, to different trips. We have the salesperson responsible for that sale, the trip price, and the quantity that they sold of that trip. So some very basic data. Now, if I wanted to analyze this data, of course, I could put this into a pivot table. And currently, this data that I'm using is all coming from one source. It's all here in this spreadsheet that I have open. So let's just walk through the process of creating a basic pivot table so you can understand why we might use the data model instead. So the first thing I'm going to do here is this data is completely unformatted. I've tidied it up a little bit. It's quite neat, but I'm going to put it into an Excel table first. This is my biggest top tip. Always put data sets into an Excel table. There are many advantages to doing this. Now, a quick way to create an Excel table is to click anywhere in your data and press the Control-T keyboard shortcut. You can see I've got my marching ants around the outside of my data set. That is the data I want to use. I want to make sure that I have a tick in my table has headers. I click on OK, and I've created myself an Excel table. If you don't particularly like your table style, remember you can change it from here to something a bit more pleasing to your eye. Let's go for a nice orange color. So now that we've created a table, we have our table design contextual ribbon. Again, what I always advise people to do when they're creating Excel tables is to make sure that you give your table a meaningful name. It just helps you identify your table. If we take a look at the first group on this table design ribbon, you can see it says table name is currently table 1. That's a bit too generic, so let's call this sales _ 2020 and hit enter. Remember, you can't have any spaces in your table name, so it either has to be one word or separated with an underscore. So I always do that before I put my data or before I analyze my data in a pivot table. So at this stage, this is where I might convert this to a pivot table. Again, a couple of different ways that I can do this. I can go onto the insert ribbon, go to pivot tables and choose from table range, or because I'm already on that table design ribbon when I'm renaming the table, I can choose summarize with pivot table from here. Now this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. So currently it's telling me that it's going to create my pivot table based off of my table range. And you can see it's picked up the name of my table, sales _ 2020, which in this case is exactly what I want it to do. I can then choose where I want to put this pivot table. So do I want to put it on a new worksheet or do I want to put it on the existing worksheet? Again, my recommendation is always separate your pivot tables from your source data. So I'm going to keep mine on new worksheet. Now, normally at this stage, I would just click on OK and off we would go creating our pivot table. But take a look at this bottom option. We also have an option to add this data to the data model. And take a look at the heading just above there. It says choose whether you want to analyze multiple tables. And this is the difference. You would use the data model if you want to analyze data from multiple sources. So in this example, all of the data I want to analyze is contained within this table range, one source. But what if I wanted to analyze data from lots of different tables, maybe other tables in this worksheet, or maybe other tables in other workbooks? Maybe I want to bring them all together and be able to analyze all of the different fields in one pivot table. That is where we would use the data model. So think about this as a way to analyze multiple sources of data and build a consolidated pivot table. So bear that in mind. Let's just quickly create a pivot table from this one data source. So I'm not going to add it to the data model. I'm just going to say new worksheet and click on OK. So here, this is your standard pivot table. It's created a new sheet at the bottom. I have my blank pivot table report and it's populated it over here with my pivot table fields. And these are effectively just the column headings from my data source. I then have the 4 areas and I can simply drag and drop my headings into these different areas to build my pivot table. That is effectively all a pivot table is. So it's very easy for me to do an analysis here. So maybe I want to see how many trips each salesperson has sold. I could drag salesperson into rows. I could drag trip price into values. And very quickly, I've done an analysis just there. I could remove salesperson, and maybe I want to see this time by trip name. I could drag that into rows. I could even add salesperson into columns to get a completely different way of analyzing this data. That is a basic pivot table. We're using one source of data in order to perform our analysis. Okay, so that's a quick recap on pivot tables, and hopefully there you can see the difference. Data model is when we want to use multiple sources as opposed to one. So with all that in mind, let's close down this particular worksheet because we're going to take a look at some of the files that we're going to be using so you can understand what we're doing. Now, if you recall, I asked you to create a folder on your desktop. It's this one just here. I've called mine transaction data. Let's double click to open this up. And in there, we should find we have 2 files, transactions 2019 and transactions 2020. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to open up both of these, and I'm going to put them in a split screen format so they're a bit easier to compare side by side. So let's open up both of them and put them next to each other just there. Now, the first thing you'll notice about these two files is that they are consistent in the way that they're laid out. So you can see that each of these files holds transaction data, but they're just for different years. So for this one here in column A, this is the transaction data for 2019. And this one here in column A is the transaction data for 2020. All of the column headings, I apologize for that motorbike going past. All of the column headings are exactly the same. So we have date, transaction ID, product number, account number, and amount. And that is consistent across both of these files. So maybe what I want to do is create a pivot table where I can use all of this data. But my data is split across two different files, transactions 2019 and transactions 2020. Now, because this data is consistent in its columns, what I could do here is I could combine both of these files into one big file and then analyze that data, which is exactly what we're going to do. Now, something else that I might want to do here is if we take a look at the data that we have in here, it's not particularly meaningful in these two files. I have transaction IDs, which are just random numbers. I have product numbers, I have account numbers, so on and so forth. So if I was doing a pivot table based off of this data, it's not going to be really very meaningful because what I might have here is a pivot table that shows me the product number and then the amount. What would be more meaningful is if I had the product name as opposed to the product number. What might be more meaningful is if I had the account name as opposed to the account number. But that data doesn't actually exist in either of these two files. However, we do have some other files that contains this data. So let's just minimize these down and take a look at the other files that I sent through. Now, the first one we're going to open is this one here. It's called accounts.xlsx. Let's double click and take a look at this. Now, what we have in here is a very small spreadsheet that shows me the account number and the accounts that relates to. So if I put this side by side with one of our transaction files, you can see in the account number column, we're only going to have one of four numbers in here. It's either going to be 5,000, 6,000, 7,000, or 8,000. But these account numbers relate to these specific accounts. The same thing occurs with the products spreadsheet as well. So if we open this one up and take a look at what we have in there, are you being slow, Excel, or did I not click? There we go. Once again, we have just a very small table that shows the product numbers, which relates to the product number column in the transaction spreadsheet, and the actual meaningful products that those numbers relate to. So if I want to build a big, meaningful pivot table that's going to make sense to my stakeholders and to my CEO and whoever else who wants to read this data, I want to combine all of these tables together and create one big pivot table. It means I'm going to be able to do things like create a pivot table that shows the product name and the amount of that product that's sold. Okay, so we have our data stored in multiple different sources. We have the products file, we have the accounts file, and then we have our two transaction files as well. So this is where the data model is going to be particularly useful. Now, I'm just going to close down all of the files that I've currently got open. Do I have anything else open? Yes, I do. Let's close down both of those and make sure that that is closed. And I'm just going to double click to open up the transaction folder again. So the first thing that we're going to do here is I'm going to combine both of these files together into one big file. Now, notice here that I've got them stored in a folder called transaction data. And currently I have the file for 2019 and 2020. Now, each year, a new file is going to be added. So I have the transactions 2021 file ready to go into this folder. So when I'm creating my pivot table and setting this up using the data source, using the data model, I want to set this up in such a way so that it's extremely efficient, so that when a new file gets added into this transaction data folder, I can update my pivot tables and any pivot charts that I've created with the click of one button. So we're going to set this up so that it links to this folder, so that anything new that's added to the folder is automatically going to be included in our report. Okay, so we're doing a few different things here, quite a lot going on. So let's close this down and let's open up Excel. Now for this, we're just going to start with a blank workbook. And I will say, if you are following along with me, make sure that you have all of the other Excel files closed down before you begin. So let's maximize this out. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a connection to that transaction data folder. I'm going to create a link between this Excel workbook and that folder. Now, anytime we want to bring in data from outside into Excel, we want to make sure that we go to the Data tab. And it's this first group here, Get and Transform Data. So this is where we can pull data in from multiple different sources. So it really depends how you have your data stored. I could import data from a text file or from the web or from another table or range that I have in my workbook. And if I click the Get Data drop-down, you can see that I have multiple other places that I can grab data from. So if I've got it stored in another Excel workbook, I can link to that from here as well. Now we want to link to that transaction data folder. And notice right at the bottom of the list, this is where we can set up that link. So I'm going to say, let's import data from a folder. And I'm going to go to my desktop where I have that transaction data folder. Now, I'm not going to go into this and select the files. I want to link to the actual folder itself. So let's select it and click on Open. And this is where it's going to pop open this little window. So you can see here, it's found the two files that are contained within that folder, Transactions 2019 and Transactions 2020. And right at the bottom here, I have a few different things that I can do at this stage. Notice I have a combine button. So as I mentioned, because these files are consistent in their column headings, it's going to be quite useful for me to combine them into one big long file. Now I can do that directly from down here. I can choose to load this directly into Excel or into a pivot table, or I can choose to transform the data. Now, transforming data basically gives you the opportunity to tidy up your data. So if you haven't cleaned your data beforehand, you could transform the data from here. So let's click that because it's going to jump us into Power Query. Now, once again, this looks a little bit overwhelming, and we're not going to go into this in any detail whatsoever. This is an entire session on its own. All you really need to know is that Power Query is a more user-friendly way of cleaning up Excel data. So if you've ever had a data source in Excel and you've done things like removed the duplicates, removed blank rows, maybe done a spell check or a find and replace, all of that process is called cleaning data. And we can do the same thing in Power Query. Check out what we have up here as an example. We can do things like remove columns. We can split columns. We can change the formatting of different columns, things like that. So this is really a data cleaning utility. Now, we're not going to really use it to clean the data because our data is already clean. But what we're going to do is we're going to use it to combine these two files together. So I've got both of my files sitting there. Notice in this first column where it says content, I have these two little down-facing arrows, and it says combine files. If I click this, it's going to evaluate my two files. It's going to show me a sample of the first file. So it's going to show me basically the first 200 rows of the first file. That all looks good to me. I'm going to click on OK, and it's going to combine Transactions 2019 and Transactions 2020 together in one big long file. So a nice quick way of combining those together. Now at this stage, I could look through and I could start cleaning up this combined data if I wanted to. So maybe I've got some errors in here, some blank rows. I could use Power Query to tidy it all up. I'm going to do a couple of little changes here because there is something that's been added to my spreadsheet that I don't particularly need, and that is this source name column. Because I have two files in here, it's helpfully given me another column which tells me what the source name is. Now, I don't really want that, so I'm just going to right click and I'm going to say remove this column. The other thing I'm quickly going to do is check to make sure I have the correct data types selected for these fields. So this one is the date, this one is a number, these all look pretty good. The amount, now this is a currency amount, so I'm going to click where it says 123 and make sure we set the data type for that column to currency. As I said, there is so much we could go into in Power Query. I'm just going to show you those couple of little bits here. We've combined the files and we can now load it back into Excel as one big long file. So at the top here, we have close and load, and I'm going to say close and load to. Now, if I just wanted to combine these two transaction files together and create a pivot table, I could select Create Pivot Table Report from here, and it's going to automatically create the report for me. Now, I don't want to do that because I have more data that I want to add in. Remember, we have that smaller accounts workbook and we have that smaller product workbook that I want to use in my pivot table as well. So instead of creating the pivot table report, I'm going to say add this data to the data model and click on OK. Now it's going to go away and it's going to create its connections in the background. And you can see on the right hand side, I have a queries and connections pane open that's telling me that I've got 730 rows of data loaded in. So this is basically those two transaction files combined together. And I should be able to check this by if I click the filter at the top here. Yes, I have both of my data sets in there, 2019 and 2020. But as I said, this isn't the only data that I want to use in my pivot table. So how can we also pull in those other two tables of data? Well, we can do this in a few different ways, but I'm going to show you how to do it using the Power Pivot ribbon. Now, if you take a look up at my ribbons, I have one here called Power Pivot. Now, this isn't a ribbon that's turned on by default. So if you cannot see this ribbon, it might be that you need to add that in. So if we go to File and down to, let's go to Options. And we're going to go to Customize Ribbon. And you can see it there selected on the right-hand side, Power Pivot. If you have it deselected, then you're not going to be able to see that ribbon. Now, if you can't see Power Pivot in here at all, it might be that you need to go to Add-ins. And I think this is under COM Add-ins. Let's click on Go. Yes, that one there, Power Pivot for Excel. Okay, so if you can't see it, make sure that you have that add-in turned on, and then you can see that Power Pivot ribbon. Because this is really going to help you when it comes to adding things into the data model. So we've got our two transaction files here. I've got two more files that I want to pull in before I create my pivot table. So what we can do here is we can use our Power Pivot ribbon. We can go to Manage. Notice that that is in the data model group. And it's going to open up our transaction data in the Power Pivot window. And take a look at the bottom. We've got the tab here, Transaction Data. And now I can add more tables into here, which is effectively adding them into the data model. So if we take a look at the ribbons at the top where we have Get External Data, I'm going to choose From Other Sources. So this is where I can now go away and choose where my other tables of data that I want to use are located. So maybe I have a table in Access that I want to use. Maybe it's a text file. In this case, I have two other Excel files that I want to pull in. So I'm going to choose Excel file, click on Next, and now I can simply browse for the first file. So I want to pull in the accounts file and the products file as well. I want to use these along with my transaction data in my pivot table. So let's select accounts. First of all, we have to do these one at a time. I'm going to say use the first row as the column headings, click on Next, and click on Finish. And you can see it's imported 4 rows successfully. And if you recall, this actual data was very short, and you can see it loaded into the new window just here. That is the account data and the accounts that match it. Now notice at the bottom we now have 2 sheets. So I've got my transaction data as one part of the data model, and then I just have sheet 1. Now I'm going to right click and rename this to make it more meaningful. Let's call this accounts. And now I can go back up and repeat that process to pull in the other worksheet. So again, from other sources, I'm going to scroll all the way down, import from Excel. I'm going to browse, and I'm going to choose products this time. I'm going to use the first row as column headings and click on Finish. And that's going to import that table into the data model as well. So now at the bottom, I have 3 tabs. I have my transaction data tab, which is a combination of 2 different files, transactions 2019 and 2020. I have my accounts table and I have my products table. And these are all now part of the data model, and I can use them to build a pivot table. Now, something that's also quite useful when you're in this Power Pivot window is this diagram view button. So if I click on diagram view, this is basically going to show us all of the tables that we've created in this diagram format. And we can move these around. And it gives us a nice visual way of looking at how our tables are related together. So you can see at the top here, I have my transaction data table, and those are all the column headings. I then have my accounts table and my products table. Now, currently, all 3 of these tables are part of the data model, but they're not linked together in any way. They're still 3 independent tables. So what do you think is going to happen if I try and build a pivot table based off of this data model, and maybe I use, let's say I use the amount field from the transaction data table and the products field from the products table? What do you think is going to happen? Is that going to work? If you guessed no, then you would be correct. Because these tables aren't linked together, Excel thinks that they're just independent of one another, so nothing is going to flow through. Let me show you an example of that so you understand what I mean. Let's close this Power Pivot window down. And let's create our first pivot table. So I'm going to close down queries and connections. I'm going to click in my data. I'm going to go to Insert, and I'm going to say Pivot Table from Data Model. I'm going to say I want this on a new worksheet. Let's click on OK. Now I can see here, look at what we've got. Forget about that one at the bottom. That's just from an old table that I was using. These are the ones from our data model. So we've got our accounts table and our fields just there, our products table and our fields, and then our transaction data and our fields. Now remember, these are all 3 independent tables. So if I now try and build a pivot table using a field from the accounts table, so let's grab accounts and drag it into rows. All looks okay so far, but if I now try to drag the amount field from the transaction data table into values, it's not working. It's giving me all of the same value. It's not able to work this out, how much sales we've generated by those different accounts, because none of those tables are interacting with each other. They're just not linked together yet. So we've got errors, well, not errors, I should say. We've got the same value, so we know that that's not correct. And take a look at this yellow message. It says relationships between tables may be needed. So we need to link all 3 of our tables together in order for this to work correctly. So how do we go about linking tables together? Well, this is very similar to if you've ever used something like VLOOKUP. You need to have a field in each table that is common between the tables. For example, the transaction data table is our main table. It has the most information. We have date, transaction ID, product number, account number, amount. The accounts table, we have account number. We also have account number in the transaction data table. So there is a common field between the accounts table and the transaction data table. So I could use the account number field to link these two tables together. Similarly, I can link the products table to transaction data by the product number field. And if I do that and create these relationships, then Excel knows about these other tables and it can perform the calculations correctly. So let's take a look at that in action. Now, I can see here, I've got this little yellow warning message. It's saying relationships are needed. So I'm going to say, okay, let's create our first relationship. So I want to create a relationship, first of all, between the transaction data table and the accounts table. So the first table is the transaction data table. The related table is the accounts table. And then I just need to tell Excel which field they're linked by. So what is the common field between these two tables? Well, it's the account number field. So as soon as I select account number here, Excel recognizes it in the other one and adds it in for me. Now, as soon as I click on OK here, check out what happens to the pivot table. You should see that those numbers work themselves out. So let's click on OK. And there we go. It is now working. Because we've created that link, Excel knows how to do the calculations. So we've created a link between the accounts table and the transaction data table. What about if I remove accounts from rows and switch in products? I'm going to get the same problem because I haven't linked products to transaction data. Once again, I have the value, the same value being repeated over and over again, and I'm getting this yellow warning message. So once again, I'm going to do the same thing. Let's click on Create. We're going to link the transaction data table and the products table. But this time we're going to use the field that's common between the two, which is the product number field. So let's select product number, click on OK, and take a look at that. Everything is now working. So now that everything is linked together, I can start building out my pivot table using any field from any of these tables. And because I've now added in additional data, my data is a lot more meaningful. Instead of just having product numbers, which don't mean much to anybody in my analysis, I've now pulled in these product names instead. So it's going to be a lot more meaningful to anybody who's looking at this data. Once I have all this data in here, I can then start using my pivot table fields in exactly the same way I normally would. So maybe I want to add in something like, let's go for a date above rows. Something like that. And you can see I'm going to remove quarters and months so that we just have the years. I could drag date across to columns so I have it organized like that instead. So once you have everything linked together, everything should work nicely together as long as you've created those relationships between the tables. Again, it's much like VLOOKUP. It relies on a common field. So that is basically how you can utilize the data model to pull in data from different sources to create a consolidated pivot table. Now we're going to do one more thing. Let me just do a quick time check. We're going to be a little bit quicker than normal in this session, which is very nice. Everybody gets to go a little bit earlier. But there is one more thing that I want to do. I'm going to show you how to very quickly create a pivot chart based off of this pivot data, and then I'm going to show you how to update with the next year's transaction file. Because if you remember, right at the beginning when we created our connection, we created a connection to the folder where these transaction files were stored. So theoretically, when I add the next year's file into that folder, all of my pivot tables and pivot charts should update automatically because that connection is there to the folder. So let's first do a little bit of tidying up of this data and create ourselves a basic pivot chart. Now, in my pivot chart, I don't want my grand totals. So let's utilize, let's go to the Design tab at the top here. And I'm going to turn off grand totals for rows and columns. So we're going to click on grand totals and I'm going to say turn those off. In general, you don't tend to have grand totals showing in pivot charts. It's not particularly very helpful. Now, again, when it comes to creating things like pivot charts based off of pivot data, be quite mindful as to the chart type that you're selecting. For example, data like this, we've got quite a bit there. It might look all right in a pie chart, but it would probably be better represented in something like a column chart or a bar chart. Even then, this data might be a little bit too much. Let's have a quick look and see what we get. So I'm going to go to the Pivot Table Analyze ribbon, and we're going to click on Pivot Chart. It's not too bad. It's going to look like that. I'm actually going to apply a filter because the people that I'm going to be showing this pivot chart to are only really interested in the top 5 best-selling products. So I'm going to use a top 10 filter on this data. Let's right-click. I'm going to go to Filter. I'm going to say Top 10, and I'm going to take that down to show only the top 5 items by the amount. Now I have a much smaller, more manageable data set to represent in my chart. So let's go back to Pivot Chart. And yeah, I'm just going to stick with the basic clustered column chart. Let's click on OK. So here we go. Let's drag this out a little bit. Of course, you can go to town on the formatting of your pivot charts. I'm going to do some very basic formatting here. I'm going to remove these grey buttons. This is the first thing I always do because I don't particularly like to have these on my chart. I might want to do something like add a chart title. So let's just give this a bit of meaning. So this is the top 5 products. We'll just leave it as top 5 products. What else do I want to do here? Do I want to do anything? I think we're pretty good here. Maybe I want to change the color, make it a little bit more interesting. Let's go to design. I'm going to go to change color. I'm just going to make this various different shades of blue. As I said, so much more you can do when it comes to formatting your charts. But what I really want to show you here is how simple it is to add the transaction file for 2021 and have everything that you've created update. So take a look at the pivot table and the pivot chart currently. You can see that we only have data for 2019 and 2020. That's also reflected in the legend in the pivot chart as well, 2019 and 2020. Now, when we created this, we created a link to that transaction data folder. So let's minimize Excel. I'm going to open up this transaction data folder. And what we're going to say is we're going to say it's the end of 2021, and we want to add the year's transaction data into this folder and have everything update automatically in our pivot table and our pivot chart. Because we've linked to the folder, we can do this very simply. So you should also have the file that I sent through called Transactions 2020-21 saved off to your desktop. I have mine in this folder called New Data. So what I want you to do is move or copy this file into the transaction data folder. So I'm just going to drag and drop this file into here. I'll give you a couple of seconds just to do that if you're following along. So now that I've done that, each year I might do exactly the same thing. If I want to have that data included in my analysis, all I have to do is go back to my pivot table and refresh it. And that is literally a one-click option. All you need to do is click in the pivot table or click on the pivot chart, go up to Pivot Table Analyze, and in the middle here, you have a refresh button. Now, check out what happens when I click on Refresh All. You should see that a column is added automatically to the pivot table for 2021, and we should get another bar in our chart. So let's click on Refresh All. And would you take a look at that? How quick has that been to do? And that's simply because we created a link to the folder, and we can then simply upload the file each year to this folder, click the refresh button, and all of our reporting is updated in one click. Really nice and straightforward. So that is pretty much what I wanted to show you today. As I said, we have finished a little bit quicker to normal. There is a lot that we covered in there. It can be quite overwhelming. And with something like this, there are numerous different ways that you can do this. I know that some people don't use the Power Pivot ribbon at all. Some people just import all of their data through this Get Data area. Some people use entirely Power Pivot. There's many different ways. I've just showed you ways that tend to work for me and ways that make sense to me. But as always, you can do your own research and find out the best method that suits you. But hopefully you now have a better understanding, not only as to the difference between creating a pivot table based off of one data source, but how you can create a consolidated pivot table where you're bringing in data from multiple data sources. And the biggest thing here for me is really linking to a folder to make updating your data so much quicker and easier, and effectively making yourself more efficient. Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on charts and interactive dashboards in Excel. I can see we've got a few people logged on at the moment. We did have quite a few register, so hopefully some more will join as we start to go through. It's lovely to be back with you all, and I hope the weather where you is a lot nicer than it is here in London today. I don't think it's stopped raining all day, which is a little bit depressing. So if you can hear any rain in the background, that is why, unfortunately. Nothing I can do about that, but hopefully it won't thunder. Now, for those of you who are new to our webinars, I'll just briefly introduce myself. So my name is Deborah Ashby, and I'm an IT trainer, and I specialize in the design, delivery, and facilitation of Microsoft training, both in the classroom and online. And I'm going to be hosting this session for you today. Now, if you are new to our webinars, then I will just run through a little bit of admin first off. So this webinar will run for an hour, and it's going to be a live demonstration. So we are going to jump into Excel and run through everything related to charts and interactive dashboards. I will also point out we're using today a new piece of webinar software, and we've both got our fingers crossed that nothing bad is going to happen and everything is going to go smoothly. But just to let you know, this is a new piece of software that we're using today. I am joined on the call, as always, by Adam Lacey from Simon Says It, and he's going to be keeping an eye on the chat panel, which you'll see is over to the right-hand side of the screen. So if you have any questions in relation to the logistics of the webinar, then please feel free to type into the chat and Adam can help you with that. Now, with regards to questions related to the content, so what I'm going to be running through today, I'm going to leave some time at the end for you to ask those questions, as it is a little bit difficult for me to manage whilst I'm training the content. Now, the files I'm using will be dropped into chat. So Adam, if you have that file, if you could drop that into the chat for me, so that everyone can download that, and you can use that if you want to practice the skills that you've learned. So this session is also being recorded, and we will make that recording available to you. So you'll have basically everything you need to run through this session again. So
that should
with
be in
all
there now, Debs, just to let
wonderful.
you know. So
Thank
in the
you.
chat box, there should be a little thing saying interactive dashboards.xlsx. If you just download that, everyone, you'll be able to follow along. Debs, just hit the little hide button on your at the bottom of your screen.
I always forget
again.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I forget that every single week.
No worries. I'll leave you to it. Any questions, guys, drop them into the chat as normal.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, let's jump across. This is just a brief agenda of what we're going to cover today. So I'm going to speak to you a little bit, first of all, about what exactly is an interactive dashboard. It might be something that you've heard. They've become quite popular over the last few years, but it might be that you're not entirely sure what they are or what that actually means. So I'll just briefly explain right at the beginning. I'm going to show you an example of a dashboard. So I'm going to show you straight at the front of the session exactly what we're going to be creating. We're then going to go through and we're going to create some pivot tables and some pivot charts. My favorite thing in Excel. I do love a pivot table. And I'm going to show you how you can format those pivot charts as well. And then we're going to spend some time designing and assembling an interactive dashboard. And we're going to do things like add slices and timelines and, of course, all of the charts that we create. And then right at the end, I'm going to show you how you can very, very quickly and easily just update all of the data on your dashboard with the click of one button. It's pretty amazing. And then, of course, at the end, we will leave some time for any questions that you have. So that is the agenda for today. Now, as I said, I just want to deal with that first question before we jump into Excel, which is, what is an interactive dashboard? Well, a lot of us deal with large amounts of data in Excel, and what's become very prevalent over the last few years is the ability to be able to display that data in an engaging way and make it a lot more visual so that it's easier for people to interpret and understand. And I'll show you what I mean by that. This is just a screenshot, but this is what we're going to be creating. So this is an example dashboard. And what you see here is by no means the only way that you can create a dashboard. You can design it however you like. So you might look at that and think, oh, I don't like that, or it doesn't fit with my company colors. Don't worry about that. It's just an example. You can design it however you like. But this is what we're going to be creating today. So what I've got here is basically an example of sales data. So it might be that I'm a sales rep and I need to do some kind of presentation to my managers or stakeholders that clearly shows how well the company is doing based on various different metrics. And what I've got here is a whole bunch of charts, and you can see that these are actually created via pivot tables. So we create the pivot table and then we create a chart off of that. And I've just arranged them onto a dashboard, and I've added a bit of design to it. So we're going to go through some of the design elements just to make it really visual, really engaging. And I hope you agree that that actually is quite a nice way to display data. What you'll also see here is that I've added some what we call slicers down the left-hand side. And these are essentially like filters. So it makes the dashboard interactive. I can go in and click on various different things, and all of my charts are going to update to reflect that. Now, the really great thing about interactive dashboards is that once you set them up correctly, it becomes extremely easy to update them with any new data. So, next month I might have a whole new set of sales figures. I can add them in very simply and update everything on my dashboard with the click of one button. So it's a really efficient way of working. So that's what we're going to do in this session. I'm going to recreate this example, and I'm going to show you how I created all of these charts using pivot tables and also how I designed this dashboard. Okay, so as I said, this is one of a whole host of ways that you can create dashboards. So enough talking, let's get down to business. I'm going to switch into Excel. And the first thing I want to do is just explain to you the data that I'm using. So I have this tab here, it says data, and this basically displays, it's a snapshot of sales information for two tech stores. So we have Computech and we have Micro World. These are fictional, I've just made them up, so don't go Googling for these two stores because they don't exist. And this is sales information across various different towns in the UK, whereas if you can't tell already, that is where I am based. So we have the month, we have the store, town, we have store code, country, the manager, category, and then some sales figures. And this is the data that we're going to use to build out our dashboard. Now, I will say that when it comes to creating pivot tables, which is what we're going to do next, it's a good idea to make sure that your data is what we call clean, first of all. Now, I've already cleaned up this data because there can be quite a lot to cleaning data, and I didn't want to take up a lot of this session going through that. It is a webinar that we've run previously, so if you're interested in all the different ways that you can clean up data, then I would definitely check that out. You can find that on YouTube, I believe, Adam, or maybe on the website as well. And,
it's on the blog, and I think it's on the YouTube channel as well. Data cleaning in Excel. It's very good, actually, guys. If you want to learn how to prep your data properly and how to get it out of a kind of messy tangle that often data arrives in from exported CSVs, then it's an essential watch.
Absolutely agree. So I've basically got my data to a clean state. So everything's consistent. I don't have any blank rows, spelling errors, anything along those lines. I've also made sure that my formatting is correct. So if I highlight column A, which is the month, and if I look up in my number formatting area, you can see that that's correctly formatted as a date. And the same thing with the sales column, I have that correctly formatted as currency. So you just want to make sure you have the correct formatting applied as well. Now, what we're going to do with this data is we're going to create some pivot tables. Now, this step is very important. I'm going to do a Control A, which is the shortcut key to highlight all of my data. And I'm going to put my data into a table. So on the Home ribbon, I'm going to go over to the Styles group and I'm going to click the Format as Table drop down. And you can select any one of these styles. It doesn't really matter. Now I'm going to choose this one just here. And you'll see it's asking me, where is your data? And I can see by my marching ants that it's picked up my data. Because I highlighted it all, I can see the range there. I'm also saying that my table has headers, which it does, and I'm going to click OK. So my data is now in a table, and I can tell it's in a table because it will automatically get these little filter buttons at the top of each columns. And also, if you look up to your ribbons, you'll see that you now have this additional, what we call a contextual ribbon. So it says Table Tools. And on this ribbon, I have all of my controls and buttons to control the design and the functionality of this table. So now my data is in a table, and it will become very apparent to you a bit later on why it's important that you do this step. If you don't put your data in a table, when you add more data, you won't be able to automatically update all your dashboard if you don't have the data in a table. Okay, so a really important step. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to name my table. So in this first group here where it says table name, currently says table 1, I'm going to call this sales underscore data. And again, you can call this whatever you like. Remember to hit the enter key just to fix that name. Now, when it comes to naming things like tables, you can't have any spaces. So I can't have a space between sales and data. It either has to be one word or separated with underscores. So now I have my data in a table, my table is named, I'm going to create my first pivot table. And if I jump across to our example dashboard, because this is what we're aiming for, the first one I'm going to create is actually this pie chart just here. So where it says sales by store. Okay, so let's go back to our data. I'm going to go to the insert ribbon and I'm going to select pivot table, which is the first one on that ribbon. And you can see here we've got the Create Pivot Table dialog box, and it's automatically picked up that I'm using the table range sales underscore data. So it knows where my data is because I've named it. I then need to choose where I want to put this pivot table, and I have new worksheet highlighted. I always like to put mine on a new worksheet. You could choose an existing worksheet if you wanted to, but I'm just going to stick with new, and I'm going to click on OK. And what this does, you'll see now I have a new blank sheet at the bottom which says Sheet 1. And I'm actually going to rename this just by right-clicking and selecting Rename. And I'm going to call this Sales by Store. I like to keep everything neat and tidy. And I'm actually just going to drag that across to there. So now, if you've never used pivot tables before, I think people tend to get the idea that they're really, really difficult, and they're actually not. They're actually super easy once you understand them. So currently what I have here is, this is essentially a blank pivot table. Now on the right-hand side, what you'll see here is pivot table fields, and these fields you can see listed are basically all of those column headings from my data. So we have month, store, town, store code, so on and so forth. So it's automatically picked those up and put them into this little area for me to use. Underneath that, I have 4 blank fields. And what I can do is just drag and drop these fields down into any one of these 4 areas to build up my pivot table. Now, the way that you do this really depends on what you're trying to, how you're trying to view your data. So in this example, I want to see all of the sales by store. Okay, so I'm going to grab the store field, which is this one just here, and I'm just going to drag it and I'm going to drop it into rows. And you'll see as soon as I do that, I now have both of my stores, so Computech and Microworld, listed in my rows. But now I want to see the sales data for that. So I'm going to grab sales and I'm going to put it down into values. And you can see now very quickly, I've been able to see what the total amount of sales are for Computech and the total amount of sales for MicroWorld. Okay. Now, the wonderful thing about pivot tables is that you can just drag and drop these around to whichever area you want to get your pivot table to display in a different way. Now, I'm going to keep it in rows for the time being. So I have my pivot table and I'm looking at this now where it says sum of sales. I don't particularly like the way these numbers are formatted. So I haven't got a currency symbol and I'm not really sure about these decimal places. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to go into value field settings. And at the bottom here, I have number format. And this should look reasonably familiar to you. It's just the format cells dialog. And I'm going to go in and I'm going to change it to currency format. I'm going to take my decimal places down to 0. And it's given me a US dollars symbol. And that's because I actually have my PC set to US dollars because I do a lot of courses for US-based clients. But in this case, I'm going to change it to British pounds, which I can never find. There we go, in this list, just to keep everything consistent. And there we go. So you can now see that that formatting has been changed and it looks slightly nicer. So now I have that, I'm going to create my pie chart. So I want to make sure that I'm clicked in my pivot table and you can see that I have pivot table tools at the top. I'm going to click the Analyze ribbon and we have a pivot chart option just here. And this is where you can go in and we have a whole host of different types of chart that you can create. So for this one, I want a pie chart and I'm going to click on OK. And there we go. There is our pie chart. So this is my first chart and there's going to be some editing that I want to do to this. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this and think, okay, what don't I need? What's confusing this chart a little bit? Now, I don't really like these grey buttons on here. Now, you might like these. They are basically filters which will allow you to, if you just want to see the information for Computech, which is a bit pointless in this case, then you can use those filters. But for this particular chart, I don't particularly need these grey buttons, so I'm going to get rid of them by right-clicking and going to Hide All Field Buttons on Chart, like so. I'm now going to give my chart a title. So this chart title is basically just a text box. So I can double click in there and I'm going to say Sales by Store. And another thing I might want to do is I've got my legend just here, or my key, as we used to call them when I was at school. And you can move the position of this legend as well. You'll see next to your chart, when you're clicked on your chart, you do have these two additional buttons, and one of them is a plus, and this enables you to control the position of your legend. So I'm going to say I want to move that to the bottom, and it puts it underneath like so. So that pie chart looks pretty good. I'm going to make that a bit smaller, just drag that in. And the final thing I want to do is I'm just going to change the color because I'm going to have a blue theme running throughout my dashboard. So I'm going to go up to my design ribbon and I'm going to go to change colors. And if I scroll down, I'm just going to pick this one just here. And again, the choice is completely yours. So there is my first chart. And if we look back at our example, you can see that looks pretty similar to what we have just there. Okay, so that is our first one. We're going to do pretty much the same for the other three charts. So let's jump back to our pie chart. Now, the second chart I'm going to do is sales by manager. And what I find is if I'm creating a lot of pivot tables and pivot charts, instead of starting all the way from the beginning again by going back to data and insert pivot table, the thing I find easiest to do is just to copy this tab. So where I've got sales by store at the bottom, I'm going to hold down my control key and I'm just going to drag and drop. And it makes a copy of that worksheet. I'm going to right click and I'm going to rename and I'm going to do sales by manager, like so. So now we're going to redisplay our pivot table. So I'm going to get rid of this chart just by deleting it. And I'm going to click in my pivot table. So now what I want to display is the sales by manager. So at the moment we have sales by store. So all I need to do is remove store from rows by dragging it outside. And I'm going to select the manager field and I'm going to put that down into rows. And you can see how that now changes. I have all of my manager names and the total amount of sales for those managers. Now, sometimes you'll have quite a lot of data listed in here. And if you're going to create a chart, if you've got a lot of data, so if I had hundreds of managers, sometimes that type of data doesn't display too well on a chart. It's going to look too busy or a bit too crazy. So what you can do is you can filter things out. So it might be that the information I want to present is maybe just the top 10 managers. So what I can do is I can right click and I can go to filter and I can say top 10. And you can see here it's going to filter for the top 10 items by the sum of sales. So based on the sales amount, it's going to give me the top 10 managers. So if I click on OK, there we go. I now have a much more manageable list. What I could also do is then sort the sales. So I could go to sort and I could do largest to smallest, smallest to largest if I wanted to. So I can see there that Spencer Lee was basically our top manager with the most sales. So now I'm happy with the way that my data is looking. I'm going to go in and create another pivot chart. So I'm going to go up to Analyze, across to Pivot Chart. And this one I'm going to do in a bar chart like so. And click on OK. And there we go. Now things are a little bit squashed up down here. So I'm just going to resize this chart. Whoops, not that much. Can get a little bit out of control. So let's move that in ever so slightly. And once again, I'm going to get rid of these gray buttons. So I'm going to right click and I'm going to say hide all fill buttons on chart. I'm going to change the chart title again. So double click in the text box and I'm going to say sales by manager. And really, when I look at this chart, I don't really need my legend because it's just showing the total. So this legend is kind of a little bit pointless. So I'm actually going to remove that just by clicking the plus and unticking where it says legend. And then the final thing for me to do is just my stylistic change. So just change the color. So I'm going to go back to design. I'm going to go to change colors. And again, we're just going to make it that same color scheme. So there, very quickly, I have my second pivot chart, which is showing me the top 10 managers. Now, I will say, when you look at this, if you look at the chart, it actually displays them in the opposite order to what you actually have in the pivot table, which I always find is a little bit strange. I have Googled this many times as to why it does that, and I haven't come up with a sufficient answer yet. So if anybody knows the answer to that, I would be all ears. But if you wanted this chart to display the other way around, you would just need to go in and sort the other way, and essentially it will put the top one at the top. So it works a little bit strange. All right, so there is our second table, and let's refer back to our example again. And the top one there is sales by manager. Okay. All right, now the next one we're going to do is sales by category. So again, I'm going to do the same process. I'm going to copy this tab by holding down my control key and dragging and dropping. I'm going to right click, rename sales by category, like so. I'm going to delete out the current chart. I'm going to click in my pivot table and I'm going to rearrange my fields. So I'm going to remove manager out of rows. So we'll just take that out. And I'm going to put store down into rows. And I'm also going to grab category and I'm going to put that underneath store. So this is showing you a different way that you can organize your data. So you can have more than one field in an area down here. So I now have store and category in rows, and you can see how that affects the way that my pivot table is displayed. So it's now being sorted by, we've got the store at the top, and then we have all of the categories, and then we have a subtotal, and then we have the second store, all of the categories, and a grand total at the bottom. Now for this particular table, I'm not interested in the grand total, so I'm going to turn that off. And you can turn off subtotals and grand totals, again, by going up to your Analyze ribbon. Oh, sorry, not Analyze, Design. And in this first group, you have a subtotals and a grand totals button. So I'm going to click grand totals, and I'm going to say turn off for rows and columns, which gets rid of that grand total at the bottom. I'm also going to, should I turn off subtotals? No, I'll keep those on for the time being. Now, I could, again, move these fields around. I could move category to columns to get it to display in a completely different way. But for the time being, I'm going to keep it like this. I'm now going to create my pivot chart. So up to Analyze, click Pivot Chart, and I'm going to do another bar chart. Click on OK. Now this one's slightly different to the ones that we've done previously because we have store and category in there. You can see the way that the pivot chart is displaying those. So we have store just here and then the categories within. Now I might look at this pivot chart and think, I'm not actually sure I like the way that that's laid out. To me, it would make more sense to have Computech and Microworld in the legend as opposed to kind of running down the side. So I'm going to take the store and I'm going to move that field across to legend. And to me, that looks a little bit better. It's a little bit cleaner and easier to see. So don't be afraid to have an experiment and move these fields around. I'm going to go through the same process of turning off these or hiding these field buttons. I'm going to widen my chart out just a little bit. This one needs to go a bit longer, I think, just so that those values aren't overlapping at the bottom. And I'm going to give my chart a title. Now let me just close down this panel. I'm going to click on the plus and I'm going to say chart title. And in here, I'm going to say sales by category. And then finally, we're just going to change the color. So back to change colors. And I'm going to select the color scheme that I've been using throughout. So there is our third pivot chart. And if we glance back at our example, we now have sales by manager, sales by store, and sales by category done. And we need to do this final one just here. So let's go back to sales by category. Same process, hold down Control key, drag and drop. I'm going to right click, I'm going to rename, and this one I'm going to do sales by month. Like so. And you're probably used to this now. We're going to go in and we're going to delete out that current chart. I'm going to click in my pivot table. Now, if when you click in your pivot table, you don't get that panel appear on the right-hand side, you can very simply bring that back just by going up to your Analyze ribbon and making sure in this show group at the end, you have field list turned on. That will bring that pivot table fields panel back again. Now this time we're going to do a very simple one. I'm going to get rid of category out of rows. And I'm going to keep store in columns, and I'm going to put month in rows this time, like so. Now what you might see is when I've moved month down there, it's actually divided it into months and month. And if I look at my pivot table, you can see I have my months, but I also have a plus next to each of these. So if I click the plus, it's actually showing me the individual days as well. Now, I'm not interested in the individual days. I'm just interested in the totals for the particular months. So I'm going to remove that month from the pivot table. So now it gets rid of those individual days and just leaves me with the months. So now I'm going to do a chart. Up to Analyze, over to Pivot Chart, and we're going to do a column chart this time. And there we go. So again, you can resize this if you want to. Again, I'm going to hide these field buttons. I'm going to keep my legend just there, that's fine, but I am going to add a chart title. And we're going to call this Sales by Month, like so. And, oh, I need to change the color. Almost forgot there. Let's go to Design, change the color. And there we go. So now essentially what I've done there reasonably quickly is I've created 4 different pivot tables showing the data in a slightly different way. And I've created 4 corresponding pivot charts. Now, once we've done this, we can then start to build up our dashboard, because what we're basically doing is we're aiming for something which looks a bit like this. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a new tab. So I'm just going to click on this plus at the bottom, which gives me a new sheet. I'm going to right click and I'm going to select rename, and we're going to call this dashboard. Oops, I'm not very good at spelling today, it has to be said. There we go. I'm actually just going to move that next to my pivot charts. So now this is where it gets interesting, and this is where you can really kind of let your creativity flourish. You can really design your dashboard in whichever way you want. And there are some amazing dashboard designs available online. If this is something that interests you and you want to start creating some really whizzy looking dashboards, I would recommend you jump onto YouTube or even just jump onto Google, or something like Pinterest, amazingly, has lots of different ways that people have designed dashboards. And some of them look so stunning, really nice ways of presenting your data. Mine is fairly straightforward, if I'm honest with you. But I'm just going to show you some of the elements of how I designed this. So the first thing I did was I went up to my insert ribbon and I just drew a big shape. So we're going to go to our shapes button just here, and I'm going to select the rectangle shape. And I'm just going to draw a big old rectangle. And we can resize this if it's not large enough, on my page. And that yellow is a bit bright for me. I'm going to go up to my shape fill, and I'm going to fill that with just a darker color. So kind of a almost black kind of a color. I can also see that I've kind of got an orange border around the outside of this. So I'm going to remove the shape outline. So I'm just going to say no outline. Now that I have the base of my dashboard, I'm going to add my dashboard title. So I'm going to go to the insert ribbon. I'm going to go all the way over to text, and I'm just going to add a text box. I'm going to draw my text box, which you might not be able to see too well at the moment. And I'm going to call this, or give it a title of Sales Dashboard. And I'm going to say this is for data from January to June 2017. I'm just going to make a few formatting changes to this. So I want to make my title a little bit bigger. So we can just adjust that out a little bit. And I'm just going to resize this text box very slightly. And what I want to do is, again, on my Format tab, I'm going to remove that white fill. And I'm going to change the shape outline to a blue color, so it kind of matches the overall theme that we have going on here. And I'm going to change the text to white, like so. And then I'm going to move that just up to the corner, like so. So now we have our title in there. The next thing I want to do is I want to kind of map out or allow some space for the slices that I'm going to add a little bit later. So if we refer back to our example, when I say slices, I mean these little panels that we have running down the left-hand side. So these are like little filters which control your dashboard. And I'm going to add those in at the end, but what I want to do is make sure that I leave some room for them. So I generally, again, you don't have to do this, but I like to just map out a little bit of space just by, again, drawing a rectangle where those slices are going to go. So they're probably going to be about that big. I'm just going to change the color of that box. So that sort of shows me when I'm putting my charts onto here, how much space I need to leave for those slices. Then it's a very simple case of just copying and pasting all of those charts into your dashboard. So I'm going to go back to the first one we created, which was our pie charts. I'm going to select it and I'm going to copy it. So you can right click and select copy, or keyboard shortcut Control C. I'm going to go back to my dashboard and I'm going to Control V to paste. Oops. Now, don't worry too much at the moment where these are being placed. I just want to get them all onto the dashboard first of all. So I'm going to go to Sales by Manager. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to copy it, Control C. And I'm going to Control V to paste. I'm going to go to Sales by Category, Control C to copy, Control V to paste, and then finally Sales by Month, Control C to copy, Control V to paste. So once we have them all on there, and I'm just going to close down this pivot chart field so we have some more room, you can really place these where you like. And sometimes this can be a little bit fiddly. Let me just refer back to my example so I know what order I put them in. So we had Sales by Manager at the top. Okie dokes. So I'm just going to move these around a little bit. And there we go, Sales by Manager. I'm going to move these around. As I said, just bear with me while I get these into a nice logical order. So I'm just going to drag these out, make these a bit wider. And I'm going to put, let's see, Sales by Store. It's going to go underneath. I might want to make that a little bit taller and also a little bit thinner. And what did I have next to that? Sales by Category. All right, so I want to put my Sales by Category in there. And again, just to make things neat, I'm just going to try and get these as lined up as possible. And you might have to drag your canvas down as well, or your shape, just to give it a little bit more room, which is absolutely fine. And I'm going to put this final one running across the bottom. So I'm just going to put it under there. I'm just going to have a big long Sales by Month across the bottom. Again, as I said, you can arrange these however you like. And just because I am a little bit OCD, I'm going to make that a little bit longer. There we go. So everything's all nicely lined up. All right, so once you've placed your charts where you want them to be, I'm going to do a little bit of formatting. I don't particularly like the way these look with this white background. It doesn't really go with my overall theme. So I'm going to click on my first chart. I'm going to go up to the Format ribbon at the top here. I'm going to say Shape Fill, and I'm going to say No Fill, which will remove that white background. As soon as we do that, you can see that my labels are now a little bit hard to see. So with the chart still selected, I'm going to go to Home and I'm just going to change the font to white. And they're a lot easier to see now. I'm going to do exactly the same for the rest of these. So I'm going to select my Sales by Store, up to Format, No Fill, change the font color to white, and just bear with me while I do the other two. So No Fill, font color is white, and then the final one at the bottom, Format, Shape Fill, No Fill, and finally font is white. So you can see how this is now coming together. Now, if I look at this and the way it's organized currently, this isn't too bad. So we've got Sales by Manager, fairly easy to see. Sales by Store, yeah. I can see Sales by Category and Sales by Store. I have my legend for both of these. I also have a legend for Sales by Month. Now, I don't really need to have a legend on each chart. What I could do instead is put what I would call a universal legend at the top. So I'm going to get rid of these. I'm going to click on the text box. I'm just going to get rid of them. And just going to delete them out. Remember, they are just text boxes. And I'm going to put a universal legend at the top. And that is just a case of, again, drawing a couple of shapes. So I'm going to go back into Shapes, down to Rectangle. and I'm going to draw just a couple of shapes. And I'm going to change this color to the darker one, and I'm going to say no outline. And I'm going to duplicate this shape. So you can do that in a couple of ways. Control D is the shortcut key to duplicate an object, but you could also hold down your Control key and just drag, and that will duplicate the object. I'm going to change the color of this one to the lighter blue for the other store. And now I'm going to add some text boxes. So I'm going to go to Insert, across to Text and Text Box. And I'm going to draw my text box. I can't remember which way around these were. Actually, I think this one was Computech. Computech. And again, I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to do a Control D this time. And this one was Micro World. And again, you can resize these, make them look a little bit neater. And I actually want to get rid of the fill on these as well. So I'm going to go to Shape Fill, and I'm going to say No Fill. And I'm going to make that text white as well. And the same for this one. So Format, No Fill, and make the text. Oops, clicked in the wrong thing. Make that text white again. And then, I think I need to remove the outline as well. So outline, no outline. As you can see, this can be a little bit fiddly. There we go. So now I can move these up. And essentially what I've created there is a universal legend, which applies to all of the charts. So it means that you can get rid of any legends that you have on your individual charts, which makes it look less busy. It's a lot cleaner. You don't really need them there if you have a universal legend. Okay, so we're getting there. It's looking pretty good. Now, a couple of other stylistic things that you might want to do, and really, again, this is all personal preference, but I want to try and show you as many things as I can, which can make it really visually engaging. So I'm going to utilize a new feature. And when I say new, I think these came in 2016 version. They might have been there in 2013. I think it possibly was 2016. But in the illustrations group, we now have an icons button. And I love icons. And actually, before I go into there, I'm going to click on my Sales by Manager. So let's click on icons again. And this is just icons which you can add into your spreadsheets just to kind of make everything a little bit more visual. So this chart is Sales by Manager. So I might want to go down and choose an icon which represents that nicely. And as I said, you can choose any of these. Let's take a little look. I'm going to add, what should we add? Let's just add this one just here. I'm going to click Insert. And you can see it's added this icon. It's currently black, but the thing I like about these icons is that they're completely customizable. So you can see now I have a graphics tools option or ribbon at the top, and I can change the fill to white, and I can resize that one. And you can place these wherever you like. So I might want to place it just above where I have all my manager names. I'll add a couple more. So Sales by Store, we're going to go to Insert, Icons. And what shall we add for this one? By store, let's do some apparel. Insert, I'm going to change it to white. Resize it. And again, you can move it to wherever you like. And then finally, let's just do one more. Sales by category. Insert icon. And let's just do this one just here. Change the fill to white. Make it a bit smaller, and you can spend a lot more time doing this than I am just here, but hopefully you get the idea. It's just making it a lot more interesting to look at, a lot more visually engaging just by using some of the features within Excel. So I pretty much have everything looking pretty good. The next thing I want to do is I want to add in these slices, and let's refer back to our example again. And you can see that we're kind of looking fairly similar to our example, but we just need to add in these little filters or slices on the side. So let's go back to our dashboard. Now, really important to add these in, you want to make sure that you're clicked on one of your charts. It doesn't matter which one, you just need to click on one of them. You then go up to your pivot chart tools, and under the Analyze ribbon, you have an option for Insert Slicer. And what this will do is it will present you with a list of, again, all of your column headings from your data. So I have month, store, town, so on and so forth. And it really depends what you want to use to control your dashboard. And you can have multiple slicers. You can have as many as you like. We're going to add in 3. So I want to be able to filter my data by store, town, and manager. And I'm going to click on OK. And it gives me these little panels, which I'm now going to move over into this little area that I created for them. And I'm going to resize them and just tidy them up. So there we have store. I then can put town underneath. I'm going to resize that. And then I'm going to put my manager one underneath that. Scroll down a little bit more. Like so. Now, currently, these slicers don't really match my dashboard, but the beauty is you can click on one of them and you get a ribbon at the top that says Slicer Tools. So you can control lots of things on Slicer Tools, and one of them is the color. So again, you can go in and pick a color more suitable for whatever theme or colors you've chosen for your overall design. So I'm just going to change mine to blue. Once I've done that, I don't really need this blue placeholder that I put in there, so I can just highlight that shape and delete it out. Now, another thing I might want to do here is with this town slicer, I have a lot of options in my town slicer. I might want to display those in a bit of a different way. So if I go up to my Slicer Tools options, you can see here it says in this buttons group, we have columns 1. So currently I'm just getting one item listed underneath each other. If I change that to 2, I get more options. I could go up to 3. So it really depends sort of how much space you want them to take up. So I'm going to say 2 because I think that's a little bit easier for people to see. Now with these slicers basically control what you see on your dashboard. But you'll see what happens if I click on, so if I use this store one and just click on Computech, when I click on it, I want you to watch what happens to this sales by manager chart. So I click on Computech and you can see it's adjusted that information. If I click on MicroWorld, it's adjusted that information, but it's only adjusting it for this first chart. And that's because this was the chart I was clicked on when I inserted these slicers. So what you need to do is basically go in and tell your slicer which charts you want it to control. So in this case, I want every slicer to control every chart in my dashboard. So let me clear my filter. So with the store, I'm currently clicked on MicroWorld, which is essentially a filter. I'm going to click on this little cross just to clear it and put everything back again. And I'm now going to go through and attach this slicer to all of my charts. And I do that by right-clicking and selecting Report Connections. And what this will show you is exactly which charts this particular slicer is controlling. So at the moment, it's only controlling sales by manager. So I just want to put a tick in the rest of the boxes. Now, unfortunately, you can't do this all in one go. You have to go onto each slicer and attach to all of the charts you want it to control. And let's do it for the final one. And select like so. All right, so now we have everything connected. You'll notice that if I start selecting items, and let me scroll down a little bit, if I select London, you should see all of the charts will change. Okay, and if you want to select more options, you can hold down your control key and select more options. And it just makes it a really nice interactive way for people to go in and be able to pull out exactly the information that they want. You know, I might only be interested in the sales for MicroWorld in London for a particular manager. Okay, so Frank, for example. And that will show me that information. Just remember to clear your filters once you're finished with them. And there you go. You've basically created your first interactive dashboard. I think that looks pretty cool. And as I said, you can really go to town with this. There's loads of different things you can display on dashboards, but hopefully this gives you sort of more of an understanding as to how it all works and why you might want to do it. There is one final thing I want to show you before we open up for questions, and that is updating. So, have I cleared all my filters? I have, yes. If I want to update this information, so currently I'm showing all the sales information from January to June 2017. Now in July, I'm going to have more sales information, and I'm going to want that to be added into all of my charts, and I want everything to update. So you might be thinking, well, that sounds a bit horrendous if I have to go in and manually do it. You don't. I'm going to show you a really simple way of doing it. So I'm going to go back to my data, my original data source. And what you'll see at the bottom here is I have another tab that says data for July. So this is my sales data for next month, for July. All I need to do is click in the data. I'm going to highlight it all by pressing Control A, and I'm going to copy it, Control C. I'm going to go back to my original data, and I'm going to jump all the way down to the bottom. So a quick way of doing that is holding down the Control key and your down arrow, and that will jump you to the bottom. I'm then just going to paste in my new data, so Control V, and that's going to paste that July data into the bottom. Now I can see there it's also pasted the heading row, so I can just go in and delete that out. Now, what you might have noticed is that the new data has automatically become part of this table, and that is why it's so important that you set up your data in a table initially, because any new data that you add will automatically become part of that sales data range, essentially. And because all of our pivot tables have been created based on the range sales data, it means that this new data is now included in that. So all we have to do is, once we've added in the data, is go back to our dashboard, and we just need to refresh. So we just click on any chart, go up to the Analyze ribbon, and we have a refresh button in here. Now I want to show you this on one that's fairly easy to see. So sales by month, if I click down here, you can see here the last column, or the last data that we have, is June. When I click refresh, you should see this update to include July data. So let me click refresh, refresh all. And there we go. July data has been added with one click of a button. So you just have to copy it back in and refresh, and that is it.
If you're not a subscriber, click down below to subscribe so you get notified about similar videos we upload. To get the files the instructor used in this tutorial and follow along, click over there. And click over there to watch more videos on YouTube from Simon Says It.